The Achaemenid kings ruled over a vast universal empire that included many different peoples, tribes, and administrative groups, each with their own ethnic, social, legal, and political identities. As Darius himself proudly declared, their realm stretched from the nomadic Sakai beyond Sogdia to the lands of Nubia, and from India to Lydia. Within such an empire, it was natural that many languages were spoken and several scripts were used. Writing, however, did not hold equal weight everywhere. In central Iran, for example, the spoken word was often valued more highly than the written. This is one reason why the reigns of Cyrus and Darius are described in greater detail by outsiders, especially Greek authors, than by native records. Even so, one language rose above all others as the glue that held the empire's administration together: Aramaic. It functioned as the official language across many regions and government centers. Local written traditions such as Elamite in Persepolis, Babylonian in Mesopotamia, Egyptian in the Nile Valley, or Greek and Anatolian dialects in Asia Minor were significant in their own areas, but never matched the empire-wide importance of Aramaic. Yet the coexistence of languages fostered mutual influence. Old Iranian vocabulary found its way into other languages, while Old Persian itself absorbed stylistic elements from foreign traditions. The Persian kings and their southwestern Iranian subjects spoke Old Persian. Because of the royal inscriptions, this is the best documented of the old Iranian languages, though its written form was not a straightforward record of everyday speech. Instead, it was a carefully constructed idiom that included archaic expressions, unusual vocabulary, and other features that gave it an artificial, almost ceremonial character. For historians, however, these inscriptions are of immense value. Together with archaeological evidence and the Elamite tablets discovered at Persepolis, they provide contemporary and Persian-centered testimony that is more reliable for reconstructing conditions in Achaemenid Iran than the often colorful accounts of foreign writers. Most inscriptions were carved in Persis, Elam, and Media at sites such as Persepolis, Pasargadae, Susa, Naksh-i-Rustam, Bisutun, and Hamadan. A few came from further afield, such as Darius's canal inscriptions in Egypt, fragments from Babylonia, an architectural tablet found in present-day Romania, a rock carving of Xerxes near Lake Van, or seal impressions from Decilium. The trilingual format of many inscriptions, typically in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, reflected respect for long-standing traditions and later proved crucial in the decipherment of cuneiform scripts. More than half of all surviving royal inscriptions date to Darius and Xerxes between the late 6th and mid-5th centuries BC. After the reign of Artaxerxes I, their number decreased, and the texts grew formulaic, often appearing in only one language and revealing grammatical mistakes that suggest a decline in fluency and a gradual shift toward Middle Persian. The Old Persian cuneiform script itself was a unique invention. First attested in Darius's monumental record at Bisutun, it was not a descendant of Mesopotamian cuneiform, but a newly designed system inspired by Aramaic. It combined syllabic and consonantal signs, amounting to 36 phonetic symbols, 8 ideograms, numerals, and word dividers. Although governed by certain conventions, the script allowed for different readings that can only be clarified through linguistic comparison and etymology. By classical antiquity, it was already obsolete and unreadable. Centuries later, travelers in the early modern era rediscovered the mysterious signs, and in the 19th century, scholars finally unlocked them. This achievement not only opened the door to Old Persian, but also paved the way to understanding Babylonian, Assyrian, and other cuneiform systems. From this breakthrough, new fields of study were born, such as ancient Near Eastern history and philology, which offered fresh perspectives independent of the Bible and Greek accounts. With access to contemporary Persian sources and archaeological discoveries, scholars could finally recognize the distinct character and traditions of the ancient cultures of the Near East, moving beyond older, limited views. The Elamite version of the royal inscriptions represents the final stage of this language, often called Late Elamite. It stands out because it cannot be clearly linked to any known linguistic family, which makes it especially challenging for scholars. Elamite had once been the tongue of the old rivals of Assyria and Babylonia, whose empire collapsed in the 7th century BC and whose homeland was later absorbed by the Persians. For the Achaemenid rulers, however, it became the main administrative language in Persis until around 460 BC. After that date, no further Elamite records survive. Beyond the inscriptions carved in this language, the most valuable evidence comes from the clay tablets found at Persepolis. These tablets, preserved in the 1930s by excavators, are known as the Persepolis Treasury Tablets and the Persepolis Fortification Tablets. The treasury texts, numbering just over 100, date from 492 to 460 BC, after which Aramaic bookkeeping on parchment seems to have replaced them. The fortification texts, numbering more than 2,000 published examples with thousands more awaiting study, belong to the reign of Darius I between 510 and 494 BC. They are linked to the administration of the royal granaries at Persepolis. Each tablet was shaped by hand, inscribed while the clay was still moist, and one side was smoothed to receive seal impressions. These records, which shed light on geography, administration, economy, religion, and social life in the Persian heartland, are also valuable for the study of names and officials. Their survival was a stroke of luck. The fire that marked the fall of Persepolis in Alexander's time baked the tablets hard, preserving them for later generations and, ironically, turning destruction into preservation. The Babylonian version of the royal inscriptions had a similar importance, for its decipherment opened the door to a vast body of texts in that dialect of Akkadian. These include royal inscriptions from Babylon, Ur and Uruk, historical chronicles, astronomical diaries, king lists, prophecies, poems, and countless economic records. Particularly valuable are the temple archives of Uruk and Sippar and the private archives of powerful commercial families such as the Ajibi and the Murashu. Yet many of these documents remain only partially published, their chronology incomplete, and their origins unclear. Even so, studies have demonstrated that Babylonia held a position of great weight within the empire. Aramaic documents form another rich body of material. Written on papyri, leather, or inscribed on pottery shards and stone, they come from Egypt, Palestine, Asia Minor, and even Persepolis. Because its alphabet was simple to learn and widely used, Aramaic had become a language of international communication by the 8th century BC. Under the Achaemenids, it was elevated to the status of an official imperial language. In this form, often called Imperial Aramaic, many texts have survived. Among them are the documents of the Jewish military colony at Elephantine in southern Egypt, which served Persian interests, as well as letters sent by the Achaemenid prince and satrap Arshama, tomb inscriptions from Decilium, and the Aramaic version of the trilingual inscription at Xanthus in Lycia. That inscription also exists in Lycian, which connects it to the wider record of Asia Minor under Persian rule. The Lycian material includes funerary inscriptions on tombs and sarcophagi, as well as coin legends, while Lydian inscriptions from Western Asia Minor represent another local voice within the empire's diverse written landscape. It may seem surprising that the well-known Greek sources have not yet been mentioned, but there is a reason. While they are vital for understanding Greek-Persian relations, particularly in their depictions of war and the cultural divide between Hellenes and barbarians, they tell us relatively little about Iran itself. Still, when we look at the Greek authors who do shed some light on Persian history, several stand out. Aeschylus, in his tragedy Persians, offers a contemporary reflection on Xerxes' campaign. Herodotus provides the famous account of the Persian Wars, along with a narrative about Persian customs and history. Xenophon is important for his Anabasis, which describes the march of Cyrus the Younger's Greek mercenaries before and after their clash with Artaxerxes II, although his Cyropedia is more a philosophical treatise than a reliable historical record. Later writers under Roman rule also contributed, including Strabo, who offered geographical and ethnographic insights, Plutarch with his Life of Artaxerxes II, and Arrian, one of the key transmitters of the Alexander tradition. Special attention has often been given to the Greek authors of the 4th century BC, such as Plato, Aristotle, Isocrates, Ctesias, and Dinon. They not only expressed judgments about the supposed character of the Persians, but also promoted the idea that the empire entered a period of decline after the failure of Xerxes' invasion of Greece. In addition to literary works, there are also Greek inscriptions that shed light on Persian affairs. One example is a letter written by Darius I to his official Gadatas, preserved in a copy from Magnesia. Another is an inscription from Sardis, recording that a Persian named Baridates established a local form of a cult originally dedicated to Zeus, but in reality connected with Ahura Mazda. The story of a Greek inscription on the tomb of Cyrus, although almost certainly apocryphal, reflects both Greek admiration for the Persian king and the tendency to reinterpret foreign customs in familiar Greek terms. Before the discovery of Persian sources within Iran itself, the history of the Achaemenid Empire was told not only through the Greek tradition, but also through the writings of the Old Testament. Books such as Isaiah, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and Daniel preserve accounts that reveal both historical echoes of Persian rule and the profound impact of the empire on Jewish communities in Palestine, Babylonia, and Egypt. These texts reflect not just historical events, but also theological ideas, ritual practices, and the development of sacred literature. As for the Avesta, the sacred texts of Zoroastrianism, it is difficult to know which parts may have originated in the Achaemenid period. The collection was only written down much later during the Sasanian age, and the surviving manuscripts are no older than the 13th century. Even so, the possibility of echoes from the earlier imperial period has long intrigued scholars. Between Kermanshah and Hamadan, the ancient city of Ecbatana, rises the great Bisutun Mountain, known in the Achaemenid era as the Bagastana, or Place of the Gods. High on its cliffs, about 60 meters above a spring-fed pool, stands the most famous monument of King Darius I. The location was carefully chosen. A major caravan road passed directly beneath, linking Mesopotamia and the region around Babylon with the Iranian plateau, continuing eastward along what later became known as the Silk Road. The mountain itself carried religious meaning from early times, and the Persians, who often sacrificed both on mountaintops and to the mountains themselves, likely regarded it as a sacred place. Another reason for its significance was historical. It was near here that Darius and his allies slew the usurper Gamata and seized power for themselves. In the inscription at Bisutun, Darius recounts this event along with the widespread rebellions that followed in 522 to 521 BC, uprisings that he crushed with great severity. For the visual design of his relief, he drew inspiration from an older carving in northwestern Iran depicting a lullaby king, dating back to the early 2nd millennium BC. The monument is both a record and a piece of royal propaganda. In that sense, it has often been compared to the res gestae of Augustus, for both rulers sought to assert their legitimacy by presenting their reigns as a cure for disorder. Each used the same formula: a first-person account displayed in a prominent place and copied widely across their realms. Fragments of the Darius inscription survive in Babylon, and even in a later Aramaic translation from the Jewish military colony at Elephantine in Egypt. Yet the two works differ in purpose. Augustus's text was composed as a retrospective summary, while Darius's was dictated and carved immediately after the events it describes. His need to prove his right to rule was pressing, since many did not accept him as the true heir of Cyrus and Cambyses. In the text, he declares that those who spread his words will be blessed by Ahura Mazda with long life and many descendants, while those who conceal or destroy them will be cursed. He even warns future generations to preserve both the inscription and the images. At the center of the monument stands the striking relief of Darius himself, the embodiment of the victorious king. He is carved into a smoothed rock face, measuring roughly 3 by 5.5 meters. Shown standing and facing right, he wears the Persian robe, the royal shoes, a bracelet, and an elaborate crenellated crown. In his left hand, he holds a bow, a traditional symbol of sovereignty, while his right hand is raised at face level. Beneath his foot lies Gaumata, the Median priest who claimed the throne. The figure is depicted in Persian dress, not to suggest his ethnicity, but to identify his pretension to power. His arms are lifted in a gesture of surrender as the king stands over him, sealing the story of Darius's rise in both word and image. On the right-hand side of the Bisutun relief, a line of rebels approaches the king. Their hands are tied behind their backs, and their necks are fastened together with a long rope. The figures are carved on a smaller scale than the king, only about 1.17 meters in height compared to his 1.72 meters, emphasizing his dominance. Each captive is identified by both an inscription and distinctive clothing, while details of face and headdress are used to suggest individuality or ethnic origin. The first 8 figures represent leaders of uprisings that flared in the year following Darius's seizure of power, revolts that he himself claimed to have crushed in a flood of blood. A 9th prisoner, the Scythian chief Skunka with his pointed cap, was added later after Darius's campaign against the Scythians in 519 BC. The order in which the rebels are shown corresponds to the sequence in which their revolts were suppressed. Behind the king stand 2 armed attendants, possibly members of the original conspiracy that brought him to power, though the inscriptions do not name them. Above the scene floats a winged figure, long thought to be a depiction of Ahura Mazda, the god invoked throughout the inscription. More recent interpretation suggests it may instead symbolize the protective spirit of Darius's royal ancestors. The arrangement of the relief and the surrounding inscriptions also reveals how the monument developed over time. The earliest stage included the carving of the king and the first 8 rebel leaders, but without Skunka. At this point, only a short Elamite inscription identifying the king had been added, and its wording differs slightly from later expanded versions. In the second phase, a much larger Elamite inscription was cut beside the relief, laid out in 4 columns with more than 300 lines, along with Elamite captions for the rebels. The irregular placement of this long text suggests that the monument was revised and expanded at this stage. The third phase introduced a Babylonian version, arranged in 112 lines to the left of the relief. Since it had not been part of the original plan, space had to be improvised, and the captions for some figures, including Gaumata and Asina, were squeezed into awkward positions. The fourth phase brought the Old Persian version, carved in 4 columns directly beneath the relief. This text contained an additional section not found in the earlier versions, and the same passage was retroactively added to the Elamite text. At this time, captions in Old Persian were also supplied for the figures, though their uneven integration shows that they were not part of the original design. It was in this new passage that Darius declared he had personally commissioned the creation of Old Persian cuneiform for the purpose of recording his words, which were to be copied and spread throughout the empire. Around 518 BC, the relief was altered again. Skunka, the Scythian rebel captured in Darius's 3rd year, was added to the line of captives. His inclusion required the removal of the earlier Elamite inscription, which was recarved in full beneath the Babylonian text. Soon after, a further section was appended to the Old Persian version, expanding it to a 5th column and extending the account of Darius's reign into its 2nd and 3rd years. The Elamite and Babylonian texts were not extended, most likely due to lack of space. Finally, the Old Persian caption for the king himself was added, now following the formal wording of the Elamite text rather than the more personal style of the earlier version. The purpose behind the Bisutun inscriptions and relief must have been more complex than the surviving texts alone suggest. Linguistic and historical study shows clear links between the Elamite and Old Persian versions on the one hand, and the Aramaic and Babylonian on the other. Yet the differences among them reveal that the process of editing was far more elaborate than a simple set of translations. Variance in wording, the difficulty of carving spoken dictation directly into stone, and the presence of extra explanations in some versions all suggest that the texts were carefully adapted for different audiences. For example, the Aramaic and Babylonian versions included figures for the numbers of enemies killed, while the Old Persian version, completed last, omitted embarrassing references from the Elamite text, such as desertions among the royal guard. This indicates that Darius's narrative was revised with political considerations in mind. It is uncertain whether the relief itself was designed before the inscriptions, or whether the text came first as a message to be spread across the empire. Both were created so quickly that their order of planning hardly matters. The earliest Aramaic versions, which have not survived, were probably produced immediately for distribution. They must have been copied and recopied at different satrapal courts so that the king's account could be dispatched rapidly across his territories. This was essential because the monument at Bisutun itself, high on a cliff and inaccessible to travelers, could not have been understood by passers-by. Small wonder that later traditions attributed the site to the legendary Queen Semiramis, for its true meaning was obscure to outsiders. How the different versions were distributed remains unknown, but it is clear that Aramaic copies were more widespread than cuneiform ones. Aramaic was widely spoken, easy to read, and written in a script suitable for papyrus and leather, making it far better suited for administration and royal propaganda. The copy found at Elephantine suggests that the text may also have been translated into other local languages, perhaps even Greek, although no such examples have survived. Interestingly, the Elephantine papyrus replaces one section of the Bisutun inscription with a passage from Darius's epitaph at Naqsh-i-Rustam, showing how later adaptations blended different traditions. Unlike the Bisutun text, which presents specific deeds, the epitaph describes the virtues of the Achaemenid kings in timeless terms. We know little about where copies of the inscriptions were displayed or how they were shared with the people, whether through public readings, announcements, or other means. Considering the limited literacy, even in regions where writing was common, it is likely that much of the message was spread orally. Darius himself confirms this in the Old Persian version, stating that after the inscription was written, it was read aloud to him, making clear that his words were intended not just to be carved in stone, but to be spoken across the empire. The reproduction of the Bisutun relief raises an important question about its purpose. Was the goal really to present an exact account of events, with the names and identities of each rebel carefully recorded? Or was the deeper aim to deliver a symbolic message? The image seems designed to impress upon viewers the futility of resistance, to portray the king as unassailable, and to make the spectator understand the core message. Rebellion brings destruction. Evidence suggests that the relief itself was not widely copied, perhaps because reproducing it would have required significant cost and skill. Instead, its power lay in the single monumental version combined with the accompanying text. In Achaemenid art, more generally, two types of royal imagery can be distinguished. Some portraits were reproduced many times, on coins, palace walls, textiles, or even shields. These circulated widely, sometimes as royal gifts, and served as repeated affirmations of the king's image. Other depictions were unique, found on seals, gems, or tombs of local rulers, and functioned as marks of personal identity rather than mass representation. The Bisutun relief belongs firmly to the latter category, yet its power is amplified by the inscription that frames and explains it. Together, image and text secure its meaning within the framework of royal propaganda. The relief presents the defeated rebel leaders in the order in which they fell, while the inscriptions supply their dates and ranks according to the territories they ruled. The text provides an official report, but the relief transforms this into a scene that transcends time and place, a chain of captives led before the king, echoing ancient Near Eastern motifs of the ruler standing over crushed enemies. The message is clear and unmistakable. This is the fate of those who defy Persian authority. Later, Achaemenid art, such as the reliefs of Persepolis, abandoned the immediate political context still present at Bisutun and instead repeated timeless scenes of loyalty and order. These were not lifeless copies, but statements of ideology, showing the king as he wished to be seen everywhere, regardless of the actual location or moment. The inscriptions themselves evolved in a similar way. At Bisutun, Darius still spoke in the urgency of his own time, establishing principles that would later form the foundation of imperial ideology. He warned his successors to guard against falsehood, instructing them to punish liars harshly so that the realm would remain secure. He justified his own success by proclaiming that the gods aided him because he had acted with justice, refraining from wrongdoing toward either the weak or the powerful, rewarding loyalty, and punishing treachery. These declarations marked the beginnings of a royal creed, the king as the guardian of truth, the defender of land and farmers, and the enforcer of loyalty. From Bisutun, this message led directly to Persepolis, the great residence of the Achaemenid kings, known to them simply as Parsa, Persia itself. Persepolis, begun by Darius around 515 BC, was designed as both a symbol of Persia and a reflection of the Achaemenid vision of empire. It served as an administrative center, hosted great ceremonies, and was constructed with materials and labor drawn from across the vast realm. Its architecture and reliefs conveyed a sense of universal order, showing the peoples of the empire bringing gifts and dignitaries gathering for banquets. Whether these scenes represent specific celebrations or timeless ideals, they projected harmony between the king and his subjects, affirming the notion that the empire rested on their collective loyalty. Set against the slopes of the Kuai Ramat mountain, the terrace of Persepolis covered an enormous area of about 450 by 300 meters, rising 12 meters above the plain. Its limestone walls, built from huge blocks fitted with extraordinary precision, created an impression of grandeur and technical mastery. Originally approached from the south, Xerxes later added a magnificent double staircase at the northwest, leading to the so-called Gateway of All Lands. This entrance was guarded by colossal winged, human-headed bulls modeled on Assyrian prototypes, intended to ward off evil. From there, visitors entered the Apadana, the great audience hall measuring over 60 meters in length and supported by 36 massive columns. The hall could hold thousands, and the stairways leading up to it were decorated with detailed reliefs of envoys and courtiers from every corner of the empire. To the southwest stood the palaces of Darius and Xerxes, along with other royal residences. South of these buildings lay a large complex of uniform two-room units, often referred to as the harem, though such modern labels carry misleading associations of decadence. The eastern side of the terrace contained pillared structures such as the treasury and the Hall of 100 Columns, begun under Artaxerxes I. The treasury was filled with small objects, many overlooked by Alexander's soldiers during their looting. The east and west sides were linked by another gateway, the Tripylon. Although only ruins remain, Persepolis once dazzled visitors with its golden fittings, painted walls, colored tiles, decorated capitals, curtains, and richly adorned interiors. Reconstructions today only hint at its original magnificence. Building work largely ceased after the reign of Artaxerxes I, leaving many projects incomplete. The site became known as the Old Palace and later served as a dynastic burial ground, with tombs cut into the cliffs of Ku'i Rahmat. A revival of activity took place in the late Achaemenid period, especially under Artaxerxes III, but the city was never again completed as originally planned. Diodorus, writing from the time of Alexander, described Persepolis as the richest city in Asia, filled with treasures, palaces, and royal quarters, all protected by triple walls and overlooked by the royal hill where the kings were buried. Architecturally, Persepolis was marked by its symmetrical layout, freestanding buildings, porticos, and uniform rows of columns. The sculptures emphasized themes of loyalty and support rather than battle or hunting, which were common in Mesopotamian art. The king is often shown enthroned, his seat supported by figures representing the peoples of the empire or receiving gifts that symbolize their solidarity. These motifs were closely tied to the ideology of Achaemenid kingship. The sovereign upheld justice, protected the land and its farmers, rewarded loyalty, and punished treachery. As Darius himself declared, anyone who wished to understand the extent of his power had only to look at the figures carved in Persepolis, bearing his throne as proof of Persian might. While the precise meaning of the gift-bearing processions is still debated, whether they represent timeless ideals or specific festivals such as royal birthdays or seasonal celebrations, their message was unmistakable. The empire was united in service to the king. Some misconceptions about Persepolis should also be set aside. It was never a closed, holy city forbidden to outsiders, as Greek artisans who helped build it surely spoke of its wonders upon their return home, perhaps even influencing projects like the Parthenon in Athens. Nor was it completely destroyed by Alexander. The burning of certain areas was symbolic, a gesture meant to mark the end of Persian dominance, but much of the site survived, and it continued to be inhabited for centuries afterward, even as the memory of its builders faded. At Persepolis, the imagery carved into stone worked together to express a single, enduring vision of Persian kingship and empire. The scenes of gift-bearing delegations, throne carriers arranged by their ethnic origins, the king in prayer, or confronting fantastic creatures, all formed part of a program that emphasized the same theme: a universal and cosmic order maintained by divine favor and the mutual loyalty of ruler and subjects. The trilingual inscriptions reinforced this idea, praising the king's virtues, stressing the duty of loyalty, highlighting divine support, and reminding viewers of the empire's vast reach. Although later critics accused the Achaemenids, particularly Xerxes, of simply repeating earlier models or mixing artistic styles without creativity, it is now understood that the Persepolis program was a deliberate effort to project imperial order and its claim to timeless authority. When Cyrus first established the Persian Empire, he built his residence at Pasargadae, about 30 kilometers northeast of Persepolis, on the site of his decisive victory over the Medes. Today, only fragments remain, but the layout suggests a harmonious blend with its setting. A citadel known as Tall Eye Taxed, palaces and garden pavilions arranged around an irrigated paradise garden, a tower-like structure used for royal investiture, a sacred precinct with 2 fire altars, and the tomb of Cyrus himself, a house-shaped chamber with a gabled roof rising on a stepped base. Even after Persepolis was founded, Pasargadae retained its role as an important ceremonial center of Persis. Farther west, at Susa, the ancient capital of Elam, Darius I raised another monumental palace on an artificial terrace known as the Apadana Hill. Its grand hall, with 72 columns, became the model for the Apadana at Persepolis. Other remains at Susa include the old citadel, a quarter of workshops and artisans, and the palace of Artaxerxes II near the Shapur River. The site is especially famous for its glazed tile panels depicting lions, hybrid beasts, and royal guards. Stone reliefs are rare here compared with Persepolis. In the foundation inscription for Susa, Darius listed the peoples and materials that went into the building of his palace, underscoring the empire's unity and reach. He described how the ground was excavated deep to the bedrock, filled with rubble and leveled for construction. Babylonians molded the bricks, cedar came from Lebanon, carried by Assyrians to Babylon, and from there by Carians and Ionians to Susa. Timber arrived from Guantara and Carmania, gold from Sardis and Bactria, lapis lazuli and carnelian from Sogdiana, turquoise from Chorasmia, silver and ebony from Egypt, ivory from Ethiopia, Sind, and Arachosia. Stones for the columns came from Elam, cut by Ionian and Sardian craftsmen. Medes and Egyptians worked the gold, Sardians and Egyptians carved the wood, Babylonians baked the bricks, while Medes and Egyptians decorated the walls. The list presents the palace as a microcosm of the empire, built by the labor and resources of its many peoples. In the 1970s, excavations at Susa uncovered a colossal headless statue of Darius, the only freestanding statue of an Achaemenid ruler to survive. Originally created in Egypt, likely for the Temple of Heliopolis, it was later brought to Susa. The statue bears both cuneiform inscriptions in 3 languages and longer Egyptian hieroglyphic texts carved on the dagger, belt, and plinth. The base also shows figures representing subject peoples, their hands raised with open palms in a gesture of submission. The reasons why the statue was first set up in Egypt and then transported to Susa remain uncertain, but it reflects the broad cultural and political horizons of the empire. Another important center of Achaemenid kingship was Naksh-i-Rustam, the picture of Rustam. The name comes from a much later tradition, which associated the Sasanian rock reliefs there with Rustam, the legendary hero of Iranian epic. In the Achaemenid period, however, this cliff about 6 kilometers northwest of Persepolis served as the royal necropolis. Here, the kings carved monumental cruciform tombs into the rock face, each decorated with reliefs. Only the tomb of Darius I can be securely identified thanks to the inscriptions that record his epitaph, while the others are generally attributed to Xerxes and Darius II. In front of the cliff stands the Kaaba-i Zardusht, a square tower-like structure probably built under Darius and similar in appearance and function to the Zindan at Pasargadae. Centuries later, the Sasanians, despite their limited knowledge of their Achaemenid predecessors, recognized the symbolic importance of the site and added their own reliefs, emphasizing its role in Iranian history and identity. Alongside these monumental works, smaller artistic creations also reflected royal power. Gold coins known as darikoi and silver coins called sigloi, nicknamed bowmen by the Greeks for their depictions of armed kings, served not only as currency but also as reminders of Persian strength. To Greek mercenaries, they were prized rewards, and in the politics of Greece and Asia Minor, they became potent tools of influence. Seals, preserved through their impressions on Elamite tablets at Persepolis, reveal the continuity of Mesopotamian artistic traditions, while also introducing new motifs that expressed the evolving imagination of Achaemenid kingship. The lifestyle of the Persian elite is also reflected in surviving objects such as bracelets, anklets, pendants, earrings, diadems, pins, belts, and other ornaments, either preserved directly or known through depictions in reliefs. Weapons, textiles, and fine metalwork also played an important role, often within the system of gift-giving that bound king and subjects together. The exchange of luxury goods symbolized loyalty and mutual obligation, reinforcing ties of dependence and favor. Finally, the influence of Achaemenid culture extended far beyond Persia itself. Provincial works of art often imitated imperial models, while depictions of Persian kings and courtiers appeared in Greek and Roman contexts. In Athens of the 5th century BC, Persian-inspired fashions and luxury items, collectively described as Perseri, offered a glimpse into the wealth and style associated with the great kings of the Achaemenid Empire. The opening section of Darius's great Bisutun inscription reveals much about the nature of Achaemenid kingship. He first identifies himself with the title Kshayatia, meaning one distinguished by kingship, a term thought to come from the Median language. He often added the epithet Vazirka, or great, which also had Median roots and echoed Mesopotamian traditions. Beyond this, he presented himself as heir to the rulers of earlier empires, Babylonian, Assyrian, Urartian, and Median, asserting that their sovereignty now belonged to him. From this, the famous title, King of Kings, borrowed from Urartu but rooted in Mesopotamian practice, became the hallmark of Persian monarchs. Darius also emphasized the inclusion of many different peoples within his realm through variations of the phrase king of the countries or king of the lands, the peoples, sometimes extending it to mean ruler over all races or many origins, and even king upon this great earth, far and wide. Royal protocol, however, always reinforced one essential point. True kingship was anchored in Persis and required descent from the Achaemenid family of Achaemenes. This principle helps explain why Alexander, despite adopting many Achaemenid customs, never fully won Persian acceptance of his rule until the death of Darius III. Succession was typically arranged by the reigning monarch, usually passing to the firstborn son, though disputes arose when questions of legitimacy were raised, whether a child was born before or after his father's accession. The rivalry between Artaxerxes II and his younger brother Cyrus the Younger is a well-known case. Their mother Parysatis argued that Cyrus had greater legitimacy since he was born when his father was already king. But Artaxerxes prevailed and was crowned, while Cyrus remained satrap of Lydia and commander of the western provinces. This episode also illustrates the practice of adopting throne names as programmatic statements. Darius meant holder of the good, Xerxes ruler over heroes, and Artaxerxes he whose reign is founded on truth. The Achaemenid monarch was never worshipped as a god in Persia, nor claimed divine ancestry, but his special relationship with the divine was a core part of his legitimacy. Darius declared that Ahura Mazda and the other gods granted him kingship. By their favor, he was chosen, enthroned, and ruled as their representative on earth. This was the foundation of what could be called the divine right of Persian kingship. To express this, the king was believed to possess Pharna, the divine radiance or charisma of legitimate rule. Although some scholars have described the Persian king as first among equals in relation to the tribal nobility, this does not reflect reality. Even if Cyrus had to persuade the Persians to rise against the Medes, or if Darius had to grant privileges to his fellow conspirators after seizing power, neither could have established their authority without commanding real power. The reliefs and inscriptions make clear that the king stood far above his nobles and subjects. He was supreme ruler, legislator, and judge, both in peace and war. His subjects were his bandaka, dependents who acknowledged their loyalty. The divine mandate and his personal abilities legitimized this exalted position, even if political struggles within the court sometimes exposed a gap between ideology and practice. The transition between reigns was a particularly sensitive moment. After a king's death, there followed a period of mourning, the suspension of normal order, and ceremonies at Pasargadae before the successor could take full authority. One account preserved by Ctesias describes the turmoil after the death of Artaxerxes when his son Xerxes II was murdered by his brother Sitindianus before the royal funeral procession had even begun. A reminder of how unstable succession could be. The formal investiture of the new king took place at Pasargadae, where the candidate underwent a ritual initiation. Plutarch records that the heir donned the simple garments once worn by Cyrus before he became king, ate a symbolic meal of figs, terebinth resin, and sour milk, and entered the sanctuary of a goddess thought to be Anahita. By taking on Cyrus's clothing, the new monarch assumed his authority as well. After this consecration, the king received his regalia, royal garments and shoes, a purple tiara, the scepter, a lotus blossom, lance, and bow, and presented himself before his people. He confirmed offices, seals, and privileges, thereby taking up his official duties. The royal inscriptions reveal how the king viewed himself and the qualities he claimed. In one epitaph at Nakshi Rustam, Darius described his reign in moral terms. He was a friend of justice, not of wrongdoing. He desired that neither the weak should be wronged by the strong, nor the strong by the weak. He rejected lies, restrained his anger, and exercised self-control. He rewarded cooperation and punished harm. He was proud of his skills as a horseman, archer, and spearman, on foot and on horseback alike. Already at Bisutun, he had proclaimed his pursuit of justice, but he also demanded absolute loyalty. To Darius, truth meant fidelity to his divinely sanctioned rule, while falsehood meant rebellion or usurpation. In this way, he defined the moral order of his empire in terms of loyalty to the king himself. For Darius, a true king proved himself both in war and in the hunt. Military skill and personal courage were the tests of legitimacy, and when joined with devotion to truth, they became the hallmarks of Persian kingship. These qualities, along with divine favor, defined the king as protector of his empire, the guardian of farmers and fields. In one of his inscriptions, Darius prays, "May Ahura Mazda protect this land from the enemy army, from famine, and from the lie." The king was thus warrior, mediator, and farmer in one, able to repel invaders, invoke divine blessing, and personally contribute to prosperity. Greek writers described the splendor of his court in Susa or Ecbatana, a palace of gold, ivory, and electrum, guarded by gates, halls, and brazen doors, noblemen stationed outside as attendants, guards, doorkeepers, and listeners, ensuring that the king, called both ruler and god, could see and hear everything. Others served as treasurers, generals for war and the hunt, receivers of gifts, or officials carrying out royal commands. The empire itself, stretching from the Hellespont to the Indus, was divided among satraps, generals, and princes, supported by a network of couriers, messengers, scouts, and signal watchers. This organization, though described by a pseudo-Aristotelian source, closely reflects the structure of the royal court and the order of empire seen in the Persepolis reliefs. Those who interest us most in this system are the king's bandaka, his dependents. Compared to the abundance of information on the royal household, our knowledge of these dependents is limited. Scholars have tried to interpret Persian society in the light of the old Indo-Iranian tripartite system of priest, warrior, and farmer, suggesting that Darius embodied all three roles in his person. Herodotus provides our main glimpse into Persian tribal structures. The Pasargadae, Mariphi, and Masbii formed the core, with the Pasargadae containing the Achaemenid clan from which the kings came. Other tribes farmed the land, while still others lived as nomads. If expressed in Iranian terms, the Greek genia would correspond to the Avestan Zantu, Phratria to Vis, and the smallest unit to the family, Tauma, with the largest being the Dahyu, or people of Persis. Darius often emphasized his pride in being Persian and invoked Ahura Mazda's special protection for his homeland. Beyond this, information about social classes in Persia is scarce. Some inscriptions use terms like amata, noble, aristocratic, tunuvant, powerful, and skauki, poor, weak, while Greek sources tend to distinguish ranks by wealth, clothing, food, and manners. Strabo offers an example. Equals greeted each other with a kiss. Those of slightly lower rank kissed the cheek, while the lowest simply prostrated themselves. Such customs suggest a clear hierarchy. but they tell us little about the common people, most of whom were probably small farmers. The aristocracy, however, is somewhat clearer. Herodotus and other Greeks hint at internal gradations, with higher and lower ranks among the nobles. Rank appears to have rested on clan leadership, especially among the great tribes, with household authority concentrated in the paterfamilias, whose decisions bound the entire family. The fate of Intiphernes, one of Darius's fellow conspirators, shows how severe this could be. When accused of disloyalty, his punishment extended not just to him, but to his entire household. Greek observers also noted family life. Polygamy was common, with men taking many wives and concubines to produce numerous children. Strabo even reports that Persian kings offered prizes each year to those with the largest families. From a Greek perspective, this abundance of wives, concubines, and children was seen as a defining feature of Persian life. Herodotus tells us that alongside the most distinguished Persians stood the 6 men who had conspired with Darius against Gamata. These companions enjoyed special privileges at court. They had free access to the king, except when he was with his wives, and future kings were expected to choose their brides from among their daughters. Their relatives were also granted important commands and high offices. One of them, Otanes, was said to have declined the throne voluntarily after Gamata's death, but he and his descendants were given lasting privileges in return. At the beginning of his reign, Darius relied heavily on the support of these fellow conspirators, for his claim to the throne was not entirely secure. Yet the downfall of Intiphernes and the pattern of Darius's marriages soon revealed that their influence was not to remain exclusive. Darius is recorded as having married 6 women, the daughter of Gobryas before his accession, 2 daughters of Cyrus the Great, Atossa and Artistone, Parmes, the daughter of Cyrus's son, Bardia, Phaidime, the daughter of Otanes, and Phratagune, the daughter of his brother Artanes. With the exception of Phaidime, none of his wives after becoming king came from the families of the original conspirators. Instead, Darius made a clear effort to unite himself with the lineage of Cyrus, the empire's founder, while at the same time arranging succession within his own household. This principle was followed by later rulers as well. Darius II, for instance, together with his half-sister and wife Parysatis, ensured that their son Arsaces, later Artaxerxes II, married Statira, the daughter of Hydarnes. At the same time, Arsaces' sister Amestris married Teritukmes, Hydarnes' son. Darius seems to have owed Hydarnes some support in his rise to power, but once he no longer needed him, the entire Hydarnes family was eliminated, including Teritukmes, Statira, and their relatives. From the time of Artaxerxes II onward, marriages with powerful families were not so much a tool of securing loyalty as they were a reward for proven service. In most other respects, the kings pursued endogamous policies, keeping the royal bloodline closed and reinforcing their own authority, which explains why relatives of the king held exceptional influence. Even with this exclusiveness, the rulers still sought to keep the wider Persian nobility on their side. Careful political maneuvering, coupled with the promise of offices, wealth, and honors, drew the aristocracy into alignment with royal interests. The king's generosity, expressed in titles, estates, treasures, and public recognition, bound noblemen to him personally, and many were entered into the royal register of benefactors whose privileges depended on continued favor. Because this favor could be withdrawn at any time, a new form of aristocracy emerged at court, one based less on ancient tribal standing and more on service to the king. This service nobility was not limited to Persians alone. for capable foreigners could also rise within it. Those admitted into its innermost circle were known as the king's friends, and for them, loyalty to the monarch outweighed ties to clan, family, or homeland. In Persia, it was not only Persians in the strict sense who lived and worked. People from many regions, such as Ionians, Lydians, Lycians, Egyptians, and Babylonians, also found employment there, sometimes temporarily, sometimes for life. Many of them helped in the building of Persepolis, worked in the royal workshops and treasuries, or labored in the fields. They were not enslaved prisoners of war, but hired laborers, recruited and paid by the state. These workers, known as kurtap in Elamite records, played an important part in the functioning of the royal economy. When the great king traveled through the land of Persia, each subject was expected to present him with a gift according to their means. Since most Persians were farmers who worked their own soil, they did not offer jewels or luxuries, but brought cattle, sheep, grain, or wine. Those who were poorer still gave milk, dates, cheese, or fruit, usually the first produce of the season. One story tells of a man named Omeses who presented King Artaxerxes with an enormous pomegranate. The king, astonished by its size, asked where it had come from. When Omeses proudly answered that it had grown on his own land, the king was delighted, sent him rich gifts in return, and declared that such diligence was enough to make even a small state powerful. A hallmark of Persian kingship was the ruler's habit of traveling across his empire, even when not at war. He spent different parts of the year in different residences. In winter he stayed in Babylon, where the climate was mild. In spring he moved to Susa, and in the summer heat he withdrew to Ecbatana, where the air was cool. By doing so, the king seemed to live in a perpetual spring. This practice was not a sign of weakness or luxury, as some writers suggested, but a practical response to the harsh climates of Mesopotamia and Iran. Later observers compared it to the seasonal journeys of medieval rulers in Europe, who also moved from residence to residence. Such traveling kingship had a political purpose as well. In each region, the monarch dealt with local concerns, heard petitions, and made his presence felt among his subjects. Ancient authors describe these journeys in detail, noting the receptions arranged for the king in the cities he visited and the crowds that filled the streets to greet him. Though some accounts present these travels as casual or spontaneous, they were in fact carefully planned events, full of ceremony and symbolism rooted in long tradition. The exchange of gifts was more than simple generosity. It was a ritual act that expressed the bond between ruler and subject, a visible reminder of loyalty and obligation on both sides. One tale tells of a man named Cyrus, who unexpectedly encountered King Artaxerxes II, far from the royal court. Ashamed that he had nothing to offer, he ran to a nearby river called Cyrus, scooped up water in his hands, and presented it to the king as his gift, saying that he would later bring him the best he had from his home. When the king reached his quarters, he sent Cyrus a fine Persian robe, a golden bowl, and 1,000 coins. With these gifts came a message. The king wanted him to enjoy the golden vessel, since he had delighted the monarch by refusing to let him pass without a token of respect, even if it was only a handful of water. He was instructed to use that very bowl whenever he drew water from the river again. When the Persian king visited the cities and larger towns of his empire, it was the duty of the local population to host him and his vast retinue. This obligation, which acted as a kind of added tax to the normal tribute, often placed a heavy strain on the financial resources of a community. Banquets held in his honor were occasions where the king redistributed the wealth he had received, sharing gifts among the aristocrats who dined with him, and at times even with his soldiers. To outsiders, these feasts might have appeared as pure extravagance, yet those who looked closer saw that they were carefully managed, with every portion measured. Each day, as many as 1,000 animals were slaughtered: horses, camels, oxen, asses, deer, and countless smaller beasts. Exotic birds, including enormous Arabian ostriches, were also served, along with geese and cocks. From these vast supplies, only modest portions were placed before each guest, and whatever remained on the plates could be taken home. The greater part of the food, however, was carried outside to feed the royal guards and the light troops who accompanied the monarch. Descriptions of the king's journeys show what this spectacle looked like in motion. Accounts of Darius III during his campaign in Cilicia give a vivid picture. Behind him marched 15,000 of his extended kin and relatives, while 200 of his closest family members rode at his side. 30,000 infantrymen and 400 royal horses followed them. Then came the royal women. Darius's mother, Sisygambis, in a chariot, his wife in another, and the women of the queen's household riding on horseback. 15 covered wagons carried the king's children, their nurses, and a host of eunuchs who held important positions in Persian society. A procession of the king's 365 concubines, richly dressed and adorned, followed in perfect order. 600 mules and 300 camels bore the royal treasury, guarded by archers, while behind them came the wives of Persian nobles, the servants, and the attendants. Finally, lightly armed soldiers and their officers brought up the rear. When Alexander's men captured the baggage train after the Battle of Issus, they were astonished to find the immense wealth it contained: gold vessels, jeweled bridles, tents glittering with royal splendor, and chariots heavy with treasure. Even hardened plunderers described the sight as one of sorrow, for it marked the collapse of so much grandeur. Parmenio, one of Alexander's commanders, wrote that among the captives in Damascus, he found hundreds of the king's concubines trained in music, dozens of men who wove garlands, hundreds of caterers and cooks, keepers of kettles and desserts, bartenders, wine experts, and perfumers. To the Greeks, such excess was the very image of decadence. They saw only gluttony and weakness in the Persian way of life, and believed it explained the empire's decline. Writers repeated Alexander's warning to his soldiers that such indulgence inevitably bred softness, and that those who consumed enormous meals were too easily defeated in battle. Yet what the Greeks failed to grasp was that this system of luxury was not simply a matter of personal excess. It was part of a deliberate structure of redistribution, a way for the king to bind his subjects to him, adjusting political and social relationships through the constant circulation of wealth. On these journeys, the king lived not in an ordinary tent, but in a massive structure that could rightly be called a moving palace. It was so large and richly appointed that it was instantly recognizable as the seat of royal authority. Wherever the king and his tent stood became the center of the empire, for within it were kept the emblems of his power. After the victory at Issus, Alexander himself seized this royal tent and the insignia inside it, an act meant to demonstrate that he now laid claim to the rule of Asia. The traveling court of the Achaemenid monarchs was therefore far more than a matter of climate or convenience. It was a political act of great weight. Each appearance of the king reminded subjects of every rank of their subordinate position, of their duty to provide loyalty, resources, and service. It was a visible lesson that their wealth, their offices, and their prosperity depended on the favor of the ruler. and that all power flowed from his presence. If we were to select from the Achaemenid rulers the two kings who carried, in both antiquity and later centuries, the best and the worst reputations, most people would immediately think of Cyrus and Xerxes. The image of Cyrus shines with admiration. He is remembered as the leader who raised his people from humble origins to global prominence, the founder of the first true universal empire of the ancient world, and a ruler who governed with wisdom, moderation, tolerance, and political skill. Xerxes, on the other hand, stands in stark contrast. His invasion of Greece was seen as proof of boundless ambition, a refusal to allow even a small nation on the edge of his empire the right to freedom, and a demonstration of cruelty and religious intolerance. To many ancient observers, his reign marked the beginning of Persia's decline in both power and culture. A comparison of modern encyclopedic entries reveals how deeply this contrast has endured. Cyrus is described as the founder of the Persian Empire, who freed his kingdom from Median control, conquered Lydia and Babylon, allowed the exiled Jews to return, and assumed the ancient title of King of the Countries. His reign is associated with tolerance and clemency, and his legacy has been the subject of much debate in political and philosophical thought. Xerxes, however, is portrayed as a monarch who rose to power partly through his mother's influence, crushed revolts in Egypt and Babylonia without mercy, and launched an enormous campaign against Greece that ended in failure at Salamis and Plataea. Although he later oversaw impressive building projects, especially at Persepolis, his rule is often seen as the beginning of Persia's decline, and he ultimately met his death in a palace conspiracy. Why then is Cyrus remembered as a good king while Xerxes suffers from a darker reputation? The answer lies largely in the sources of the ancient world. For Cyrus, no royal inscriptions from Iran itself survive to give his own voice, yet his memory was preserved with care. His tomb at Pasargadae was revered for centuries, and popular traditions in the oral culture of Iran kept his name alive. The Greeks recorded fragments of this tradition, and their works have shaped much of how we see Cyrus today. In addition, biblical texts and Mesopotamian records close in time to his reign also reinforced the image of a ruler both powerful and benevolent. Herodotus helped establish this lasting picture, presenting Cyrus and his Persians as modest, rational, and courageous. Cyrus himself, called father by his subjects, is portrayed as both a skilled general and a wise statesman. Tales such as his mercy toward the defeated kings Astyages and Croesus became lasting symbols of magnanimity in victory. Yet it was Xenophon who gave Cyrus his most enduring image. In his Cyropedia, a semi-historical biography, he portrayed Cyrus as the model of the ideal ruler, wise, tolerant, generous, and beloved by his people. The book was widely read in Europe for centuries, shaping the way generations thought about kingship. Xenophon described how Cyrus united vast lands stretching from India to Egypt under his sole authority, caring for his subjects like children and being revered in return as a father. But he also noted how, after Cyrus's death, his empire quickly began to fracture, hinting at the contrast between the empire's ideal founding and its later decline. The Hebrew scriptures gave Cyrus an almost sacred stature. In the book of Isaiah, he is described as God's chosen instrument, a shepherd who would restore Jerusalem and order the rebuilding of the temple. This religious endorsement established Cyrus as a unique figure among foreign rulers, remembered not only for his conquests, but also for his role in the divine plan. Finally, Mesopotamian texts such as the Nabonidus Chronicle, the Cyrus Cylinder, and the so-called Persian verse account reinforced this image. These works, written during or shortly after his lifetime, praise Cyrus while sharply criticizing his predecessor, Nabonidus. They depict him as the legitimate and favored ruler who brought peace and order to Babylonia. Taken together, these traditions, Greek accounts, biblical writings, and Babylonian inscriptions, combined to shape a consistently positive legacy for Cyrus. In contrast, Xerxes was remembered through stories of failure, arrogance, and decline, leaving behind a reputation almost the opposite of his famous ancestor. The Cyrus Cylinder from Babylon, now kept in the British Museum, offers one of the clearest windows into the self-presentation of the first Persian king. This inscription belongs to the tradition of royal foundation texts and is divided into several sections. It begins with an introduction that condemns Nabonidus, the last Babylonian king, and explains how Marduk, the chief god of the city, chose Cyrus to take control. It then presents the royal protocol and genealogy, followed by a favorable assessment of Cyrus and his restoration policies. A prayer is offered to Marduk for the well-being of Cyrus and his son, after which the inscription declares that the empire is at peace. Finally, it describes the king's building activities in Babylon. One striking passage accuses Nabonidus of corrupting the worship of Marduk and bringing harm to the city. In response, the god searched across all lands for a righteous ruler to lead his people, and he selected Cyrus of Anshan, appointing him as king over the world. The text has Cyrus declare his titles: King of Babylon, King of Sumer and Akkad, ruler of the four corners of the earth, and descendant of a long royal line loved by Marduk and Nebo. Cyrus claims that he forbade oppression, sought peace in Babylon, abolished forced labor, and restored the sanctuaries of many cities that had long been in ruins. He returned sacred images to their shrines and resettled displaced populations. Many scholars have connected these statements with the biblical accounts describing Cyrus's order to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem and to allow the Judeans to return to their homeland. Whether or not this specific instruction is contained in the cylinder, the inscription reinforces the picture of Cyrus as a ruler of clemency and piety. Combined with Herodotus's praise of his moderation, Xenophon's admiration for his talents, and the testimony of the Old Testament, the image of Cyrus has often appeared to later generations as that of an ideal monarch. By contrast, Xerxes, the son of Darius and Atossa, developed a far harsher reputation. Raised within the royal household and indulged in luxury, he was said to have inherited the same weaknesses that had brought misfortune to Cambyses, the son of Cyrus. Chosen as heir under his mother's influence, he began his reign by crushing uprisings in Egypt and Babylonia. In Egypt, he not only subdued the revolt, but imposed an even heavier rule than before, placing his brother Achaemenes in charge of the province. When Babylonia rose again in 479, ancient sources accuse Xerxes of responding with great brutality. Herodotus and Strabo claim that he plundered sacred treasures, removed a massive golden statue from the Temple of Babylon, and killed the priest who resisted him. He is also blamed for destroying the tomb of Marduk, which later lay in ruins when Alexander considered but abandoned a plan to rebuild it. Xerxes then turned his attention to Greece. For 3 years he prepared a vast expedition to avenge the defeat at Marathon. Accounts emphasize his ruthlessness, punishing the waters of the Hellespont, executing the son of a wealthy supporter when he asked for leniency, desecrating the corpse of Leonidas, and burning the shrines of Athens. Yet the campaign ended in disaster. After the crushing defeat at Salamis, he retreated to Susa, and the following year his general Mardonius fell at Plataea. Abandoning his ambitions in Greece, Xerxes spent the rest of his reign on the embellishment of Persepolis and the intrigues of his court. Ancient writers describe his indulgence in affairs, including his scandalous relationship with his niece Artainte, which provoked violent conflict within the royal family and led to the death of his brother Masistes and his household. In 465 BCE, Xerxes and his eldest son, Darius, who had been named heir to the throne, were assassinated in a palace conspiracy. Their images, once displayed on the grand stairway of the Apadana at Persepolis, were removed and hidden away in the treasury. Even the dramatist Aeschylus in The Persians captured the contrast between Xerxes and his father Darius, portraying the younger king as one who squandered what had been gained by the spear, lacking the strength to extend or even preserve his inheritance. Modern scholars often highlight Xerxes' harshness through an inscription discovered in Persepolis in 1935, with additional copies later found in Pasargadae. Known as the Diva inscription, it records Xerxes declaring that upon becoming king, he suppressed unrest in one of his provinces with the aid of Ahura Mazda, and that he abolished the worship of false gods, destroying their sanctuaries and ordering that only Ahura Mazda be venerated according to proper ritual. Such proclamations have been taken as evidence of his intolerance. Other inscriptions, including one that closely mirrors the epitaph of Darius at Nakshi Rustam, have been interpreted as proof that Xerxes lacked originality, simply presenting himself as a ruler walking in his father's shadow. Critics have asked whether Xerxes, who observed battles from a sheltered position rather than fighting in them, could truly claim to be a tested warrior, as Darius once had, or whether a man prone to violent outbursts could credibly declare, as his father did, that he mastered his anger through self-control. Even his building projects at Persepolis are often dismissed as imitations of what Darius had already set in place. Taken together, these accounts seem to confirm the familiar image of Cyrus as the ideal ruler and Xerxes as his opposite. Yet, when the context of these testimonies is considered more carefully, a more complicated picture emerges. Herodotus, who is often praised as the father of history, also offered a darker portrayal of Cyrus, depicting him at times as harsh, intolerant, and quick-tempered. His death, according to Herodotus, reflected the fate of rulers who pursued conquest without limit. Despite these criticisms, however, Herodotus seems to have been captivated by Cyrus's character, perhaps reflecting both the admiration many Persians held for their first king and the tendency of later generations to romanticize his achievements. Writing a century after Cyrus's death, the Greek historian was more focused on the wars of Darius and Xerxes than on Cyrus himself, which may explain why the founder of the empire appeared in a softer light. Xenophon's Cyropedia presents an even more idealized version of Cyrus, though this work is now recognized as fictional and does not fit neatly into the category of history. It reflects Xenophon's observations of Persian customs, but also belongs to the Greek tradition of political philosophy, resembling the Mirrors for Princes literature that explored the qualities of the ideal ruler. At the same time, scholars have detected elements of Iranian folklore within it, though the balance between Greek invention and Iranian tradition remains difficult to assess. Whatever its origins, Xenophon's purpose demanded a noble and inspiring Cyrus. The Old Testament also cast Cyrus in a favorable light. In the books of Chronicles, Ezra, and Isaiah, he is presented not as a conqueror, but as the chosen instrument of God, bringing the Jewish exile to an end and allowing the temple in Jerusalem to be rebuilt. These passages, however, are not simple historical records. They are theological texts promising a moment of renewal for Israel. Whether the actual decree to rebuild the temple and restore worship can be traced directly to Cyrus, or represents a later projection of hopes onto his figure, is still debated. The Cyrus cylinder itself, often read as confirmation of this tolerant policy, should be seen as a carefully constructed piece of royal propaganda. It was not intended as a neutral chronicle, but as a manifesto designed to legitimize Cyrus in Babylon by portraying him as the chosen of Marduk, the city's chief god. Its message reflects the ideological conflict between Nabonidus, the ousted king, and the new ruler, rather than a straightforward record of Cyrus's character. When other, less frequently cited sources are taken into account, the image of Cyrus becomes more complex. The conquest of Media, for example, was not as bloodless as classical writers suggest. Babylonian texts claim that Ecbatana was plundered and its treasures carried off, and traditions about the fate of King Astyages vary, with some reports stating that he was killed. Similarly, Cyrus's conquest of Babylon itself may have been peaceful, but earlier battles were not. The Nabonidus Chronicle recounts how at Opis, on the Tigris, Cyrus defeated the Akkadian army, seized their wealth, and slaughtered captives. Even the famous story of his mercy toward Croesus, king of Lydia, has proven to be more legend than fact. Some sources say Croesus died when Sardis fell, and the tradition of his survival appears to have developed only later, reshaped over time into a tale of divine intervention, and finally into Herodotus's account of Cyrus sparing his life. Taken together, these examples show that Cyrus was not simply the benevolent and tolerant ruler often imagined, nor was Xerxes necessarily as wholly intolerant and reckless as later depictions suggest. Both kings were remembered through layers of tradition, ideology, and propaganda, each shaped as much by the needs of their storytellers as by their actual deeds. It is generally accepted that Ionian forces aided Croesus in his struggle against Cyrus. In response, Cyrus revoked their legal and political privileges, except for Miletus, on the grounds that they had ignored his call to break away from Lydia. Open conflict between the Persians and the Ionians began only after the revolt of Pactis was crushed, an uprising in which most of the coastal cities had taken part. The first to suffer from the counterattack led by Cyrus's general Mazares were Priene and Magnesia on the Meander. The leading families or the entire population of Priene were enslaved, likely through deportation, while Magnesia was thoroughly plundered. After Mazares' death, command passed to Harpagus, Cyrus's trusted ally from the Median Wars. Under his leadership, the Persians subdued not only Caria and Lycia, but also nearly all the Ionian cities: Phocia, Teos, Clazomenae, Lepidus, Colophon, Ephesus, Myos, Eretria, and probably Smyrna as well, leaving Miletus as the only one spared, since it had not joined the rebellion. Phocia and Teos fell when the Persians raised an artificial mound against their walls, but Herodotus records that the inhabitants abandoned their cities shortly before the final assault, seeking refuge in new settlements. The conquest of Smyrna is supported by archaeological finds. Houses were destroyed, and the newly constructed temple, with its votive offerings and surrounding terrace walls, was burned. The accusation that the Persians desecrated temples is backed by Herodotus's account that the Phocians emptied their sanctuary before fleeing, clearly to prevent Persian looting. Little is known of further punishments beyond conscription into the Persian army, and it is believed that taxation under Persian rule was lighter than under the Lydians. These events highlight the need to evaluate Cyrus with more nuance than traditional stories often allow. The question remains, did he follow a coherent political strategy, or were his actions simply shaped by his character? A useful comparison can be drawn with Xerxes, especially as he appears in Herodotus's work. Though not an eyewitness, Herodotus took care to recognize the strengths of Persia's leaders, and he gave Xerxes a prominent role as a strategist. Contrary to modern depictions of him as an arrogant despot, Herodotus's portrayal is more complex. While Xerxes wielded considerable power, he rarely acted in complete isolation. He was persuaded into the Greek campaign and often claimed to be guided by divine impulses, choices that frequently ended in disaster. His tendency to make ill-fated decisions has led some to describe him as a tragic figure. Herodotus, writing 2 generations after Salamis, could hardly rely on unbiased sources. His portrait of Xerxes should therefore be read more as a reflection on fate and human agency than as an accurate biography. Consider the famous example of Xerxes at Salamis, seated and seemingly indifferent to the battle's outcome. Modern commentators interpret this as incompetence, yet it may have been dictated by ritual or royal custom, a behavior expected of a Persian monarch. What the Greeks saw as cruelty or passivity may, in fact, have carried a symbolic or ceremonial meaning. Herodotus also recounts a scandal that unfolded after Xerxes withdrew from Greece. He became enamored with the wife of his brother Mecystes, and when she refused him, he arranged for her daughter to marry his own son Darius, hoping to achieve his aim indirectly. Yet while in Susa, his passion shifted to his daughter-in-law Artente, who returned his affection. The affair was exposed when Artente demanded, as a gift, the king's robe woven by Queen Amestris, a garment she refused to surrender. Furious, Amestris blamed Artente's mother and took revenge during the great royal banquet, when no request could be denied. She demanded Mecystes' wife as her prize. Although Xerxes was appalled, he was bound by custom and reluctantly complied. Afterward, Xerxes attempted to force Mecystes to repudiate his wife and marry one of the king's daughters, but Mecystes refused. Discovering that his wife had been mutilated by Amestris' orders, Mecystes tried to raise a revolt in Bactria. Before he could succeed, Xerxes had him, his sons, and his followers executed during their journey eastward. This story, drawn from oral tradition, should not be taken as an eyewitness account. On the contrary, every part of it carries a symbolic meaning rooted in the Iranian world, one that Greek audiences would not have fully understood. For example, there was a tradition that the king must grant the request of anyone he had invited to ask for a gift, as proof of his authority. When Artente asked not for any robe, but for the king's own garment, she was asking for the very symbol of his sovereignty. Her demand was not for herself alone, but for her family, and this is why Amestris sought revenge in defense of her son, the crown prince. The punishment she inflicted was the kind of retribution familiar in Iran, where rebels often had their nose, ears, or tongue cut off. Mecystes, too, ultimately paid with his life for his ambition to rule. Some scholars have suggested that even his name may mean the greatest or the highest, perhaps not a personal name at all, but a title. If this is the case, then Mecystes might have been identified with Xerxes' elder brother Ariamenes, who was said to have governed Bactria but disappears from later accounts, possibly due to his assassination. If so, Herodotus may have unwittingly woven into his tale a distorted version of an attempted usurpation within the Achaemenid family. Accusations that Xerxes committed atrocities in Babylonia are equally uncertain. He is sometimes said to have destroyed the great temple of Marduk, tearing it down so completely that, when Alexander later ordered it rebuilt, the ruins had not yet been cleared away. Another charge claims that Xerxes carried off the massive golden statue of Marduk and had it melted down. Yet there is reason to doubt these stories. Herodotus himself did not attribute the removal of the Marduk statue to Xerxes, but rather described the taking of another figure, possibly representing a different god or an earlier king. What is clear is that the Temple of Marduk and its cult continued to function until the end of Achaemenid rule. Alexander's later restoration efforts were not the rebuilding of a temple long lost, but the renewal of sanctuaries in line with the ancient expectation that kings prove their legitimacy by supporting the gods' houses. In addition, recent findings show that Xerxes continued to use the title King of Babylon well into his reign, despite claims to the contrary. The famous Diva inscription has also been misunderstood. It was not a specific reference to one incident of idol worship, but a general proclamation. Achaemenid inscriptions were deliberately timeless in nature. Xerxes was declaring for all time that those who turned against the king would be punished and that the sacred places of rebels would be destroyed. This was a programmatic statement of ideology, not a description of a single campaign. His repetition of formulas from his father's inscriptions was not a sign of unoriginality, but rather a deliberate choice to affirm the enduring principles of the empire. He never ordered his subjects to abandon their gods for Ahura Mazda. What he insisted upon was loyalty. If religion became bound up with rebellion, then both the insurgents and the shrines they invoked could expect destruction. This helps explain why the Acropolis of Athens was destroyed, but also why Xerxes immediately commanded that sacrifices be made to the Athenian gods by exiles loyal to him. If we compare Xerxes with Cyrus, the contrast often drawn between them becomes less convincing. Cyrus's policies were shaped in ways similar to those of earlier Near Eastern rulers. Alongside his well-known acts of restoring temples, repatriating exiles, and permitting religious diversity, he also plundered shrines and deported populations when it suited his needs. His reputation for tolerance was aided by political circumstances that favored him and by the absence of events that might have tarnished his image. Unlike Xerxes, he ruled before the outbreak of direct conflict with Greece, and there were groups who had every reason to promote his success and present him as an ideal ruler. The real difference between Cyrus and Xerxes lies in their circumstances. Cyrus was the founder of an empire, leading charismatic campaigns with the promise of wealth and new lands. Xerxes inherited a consolidated dominion and had to defend and preserve what had already been institutionalized by Darius. Yet in their methods of maintaining power, the two rulers were much alike. Anyone who refused to accept the transfer of sovereignty to the conqueror and instead took up arms to reclaim independence faced severe punishment under both kings. Even their approach to religion followed the same principle: loyalty first. Both men were willing to respect the faiths of their subjects and even to support their cults when it served to strengthen the bond between ruler and people. Neither was driven by religious zeal, but neither embraced tolerance as a moral principle in the modern sense. Their concern was always political stability, and in this, Xerxes was no different from the empire's founder. In his inscriptions, Darius justified his rule in several distinct ways, First, he emphasized his lineage, presenting himself as a member of the Achaemenid clan, a Persian, and an Aryan. Second, he highlighted his position as the rightful successor to the kings of earlier great empires, portraying himself as part of an unbroken tradition of sovereigns. Finally, he claimed a divine mandate, declaring that Ahura Mazda had granted him kingship. For Darius, kingship was not simply an abstract idea of rulership, but a tangible possession, the kingdom itself. A satrap, for instance, was called a protector of the kingdom, but he was not a king in his own right because he did not rule over a kingdom of his own. In the same way, the title King of Kings did not refer to his authority over subordinate rulers, but rather to his position in the line of great monarchs who had ruled before him. Official texts never spoke of a Persian kingdom. Instead, Persis was regarded as the Persian homeland, while the empire as a whole was described as the land of the king. Greek historians confirm this view. Thucydides records in a treaty of the early 5th century that all the lands and cities once held by the king's ancestors belonged rightfully to him. For centuries, thinkers considered the succession of empires as a guiding principle of world history, one that shaped political and religious interpretation of events. Herodotus spoke of 3 empires in succession: Assyrians, Medes, and Persians, while the Book of Daniel later proposed a cycle of 4, adding Babylonians and the Greek rulers of the Hellenistic age. Cyrus was often seen as the ruler for whom the idea of a threefold succession had first been formulated, though this way of thinking could also suggest not only the rise, but the eventual fall of every world power, an idea that became prominent in later apocalyptic writings. By the time Darius died in 486 BC, the Achaemenid Empire had grown into a vast dominion. It included Media, Lydia, Babylonia, eastern Iran, and parts of Central Asia conquered by Cyrus, as well as Egypt annexed by Cambyses, and further territories such as Thrace and India acquired shortly before his death. This created a state unlike anything seen before: large, ethnically diverse, and culturally varied. In many of these lands, the Persians had arrived as conquerors, often displacing established dynasties. Although previous contacts with Elam, Babylonia, or Media had given them some familiarity with older traditions, the challenge was how to define sovereignty at both the imperial and local level. Persian rulers developed certain characteristic policies, many of which can be seen in the actions of Cyrus and Xerxes. They often practiced tolerance in religious matters, sometimes even supporting local cults through offerings and patronage if the gods in question were associated with stability and peace. At the same time, temples were expected to pay taxes and remain politically loyal. This balanced approach to religion was a consistent feature of Achaemenid rule. Yet Persian methods of securing authority were very different from those later pursued by Rome. The Romans gradually integrated their subjects into a shared cultural and political framework, a process partly desired by local elites and actively encouraged by imperial policy. Tacitus, for example, described how the governor Agricola encouraged the Britons to build temples, houses, and markets, introduced them to Roman dress and language, and even educated the sons of chieftains in Roman learning, so that over time they adopted Roman customs while unknowingly giving up their independence. Nothing similar occurred under the Persians. The empire had no colonies or municipia like those of Rome, where conquerors and subjects mixed on a daily basis, nor did it offer provincial elites the widespread possibility of advancing into the highest ranks of government. Roman policy eventually extended citizenship across the empire, But in Persia, the great offices of state were usually reserved for Persians themselves. A few exceptions are known. The Carian dynasts, such as Mausolus, a non-Persian satrap named Balisus, and Greek generals like Memnon and Mentor. But such cases were rare. Foreigners could receive honorary titles or generous rewards for loyalty, yet they rarely entered the decision-making circles of the empire. Even though the Persians allowed a considerable degree of local autonomy and sometimes adopted the traditions of conquered peoples, they also maintained a clear sense of distinction. Persian language, writing, and religion were not widely adopted beyond their own people, and unlike Roman culture, they did not become models of daily life for others within the empire. To be Persian was to stand apart, and this identity remained central to the structure of Achaemenid power. Many regional studies suggest that the ruling elites of most subject peoples, Egypt perhaps being the main exception, did not see the Persian king as a foreign oppressor. Instead, they regarded him as the guarantor of stability, order, and prosperity, and ultimately as the protector of their own position. The empire faced no real external danger until the rise of Macedonia, and not even then until the victories of Alexander, who in many ways adopted Achaemenid political practices. The loss of outlying provinces or the ambitions of individual governors posed less of a threat to the empire than disputes within the royal family itself. In fact, the decentralized structure of the Achaemenid state, which allowed considerable local autonomy, usually strengthened rather than weakened the system, because it operated under constant supervision from the center. Far from being a fragile power, the empire rested on strong foundations, though the exact nature of its ethnic, territorial, and fiscal organization remains a subject of debate today. Part of the difficulty lies in the different lists that survive, each recording units of the empire in different ways. The royal inscriptions of Darius, for example, describe the peoples who submitted to him, paid tribute, or carried out his commands. On his tomb and on statues from Susa, these groups are also represented in relief. The Persian term used in these inscriptions, dahyava, has been translated variously as countries, peoples, or populations. These lists do not cover the entire empire and are not administrative records in the sense of satrapies. Rather, they reflect a mix of political realities, such as conquests or losses, and follow traditions of Assyrian and Babylonian inscriptions that presented subject peoples in a symbolic order. Darius's successors largely copied these models, reinforcing the image of continuity. Only Xerxes introduced a more ambitious version, in which he boasted of the immense expanse of his dominion, listing Persians, Medes, Elamites, Aracosians, Armenians, Drangians, Parthians, Aryans, Bactrians, Sogdians, Choresmians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Satygidites, Lydians, Egyptians, Greeks both by the sea and across the sea, the people of Makkah, Arabs, Gandharans, Scythians, Cappadocians, Dahai, Saka tribes, Thracians, Libyans, Carians, and the people of Kush. Greek authors provide a different type of list, often arranging armies according to ethnic groups, which reflects literary tradition rather than a formal classification of the empire. Herodotus, for instance, described 20 districts that paid tribute, but these often combined multiple peoples under a single heading, raising questions about his sources and how his information compares with Persian inscriptions. Plato, in contrast, divided the empire into 7 regions, a scheme connected with the number of Persian nobles who conspired against the usurper Gaumata. Because official lists of satrapies from the Achaemenid period do not survive, scholars rely on scattered references in Greek writers. These usually name individual satraps, but rarely describe the full territory they governed, which makes it nearly impossible to draw precise provincial boundaries on maps. Western sources also used different terms for these governors, such as prefectus or epitropos, which complicates identification. Satraps, moreover, were not the highest officials in the hierarchy. In Babylonia, for example, records from the early years of Cyrus mention a governor of the land before they refer to the first satrap of Babylon and the Western territories. Other titles also appear, such as Keranos, known from Asia Minor, which denoted a military commander with exceptional authority. In certain regions, local dynasties like those of Caria, Lycia, and Cilicia continued to rule under Persian oversight, while some cities were governed by their own kings. In other cases, such as with mountain tribes in the Zagros, no satrapal administration is attested at all. Some of these groups did not even pay tribute, but instead received gifts from the king. Persis itself, the Persian homeland, held a special position within the empire, distinct from the rest. At the level of the satrapies, or comparable territorial units, the satraps were assisted by a variety of subordinate officials. Some of these men had no fixed title, and their exact responsibilities remain uncertain. Among them were the phyloi, or friends, the homotrapezoi, or table companions, and the skeptochoi, or staff-bearers, who served Cyrus the Younger. Satraps, such as Pharnabazus, relied on cavalry commanders, while biblical sources speak of men under the governor. The administrative offices also included scribes, secretaries, and other chancery officials, as well as judges and provincial overseers. In addition, satrapal courts were attended by royal informants, often described by modern scholars as the eyes and ears of the king. Beneath the satrapy level, the structure continued in a similar fashion. From different regions, we hear of hyparchs under the satraps. In Babylonia, the office of Pauwatu functioned as governor, while in Ebir Nari, the territories west of the Euphrates, there were governors known as Bel Pawati Ebir Nari, or Pahat Yehudaye, in Judea. In Egypt, the system is particularly well documented. There, the satrap was supported by a provincial superintendent called the frateraka. At Elephantine and Syene, this official oversaw a haftaxvapata, literally a seventh-part protector, who combined both military and civil roles, serving as garrison commander under the title Chief of the Army, and also as a judicial officer referred to as Segan. At the local level, the administration took yet other forms. Xenophon's account of the retreat of the 10,000 mentions village heads in Armenia, called komarchai, who acted both as leaders of individual settlements and as supervisors of several villages. Cities appear not to have been administered directly by Persians, yet the territories surrounding them clearly were. We have evidence of officials in charge of treasuries, which were not only places of storage, but also functioning workshops, as well as managers of food depots, village granaries, and magazines. Garrisons were another key feature of Achaemenid rule. Supplied from local resources by the satraps, they were commanded by officers appointed by the king himself. At the lowest level of the imperial hierarchy were the lands owned by members of the royal family, estates granted to aristocrats and loyal benefactors, the holdings of military settlers in Babylonia, and special communities of deported peoples who served the crown in exchange for rations. The empire's strength ultimately rested on the steady flow of tribute and taxes, the acceptance of Persian law, and the recognition of the king's supreme authority. Loyalty could also be demonstrated by service in the army, whether voluntary or imposed. Herodotus provides a vivid account of the system established under Darius. Once the provinces were organized and their governors appointed, Darius fixed the amounts of tribute to be paid, assigning peoples and regions to one another for administrative convenience. Those who paid in silver rendered a Babylonian talent, while those who paid in gold supplied the weight of a Euboean talent. Under Cyrus and Cambyses, there had been no such regular assessments, and revenue was taken in the form of gifts. It was this transformation, Herodotus reports, that earned Darius the nickname of huckster, while Cambyses was called master and Cyrus father, the one seeking profit everywhere, the second harsh and imperious, and the third merciful and devoted to his people's welfare. The new tribute system was felt as a sharp break with earlier practice. Payments that had once been voluntary offerings were now calculated and enforced. Yet some groups were still exempt. Ethiopians, Colchians, and Arabs did not pay tribute but continued to send gifts, acknowledging Persian overlordship while retaining a degree of autonomy. These same groups nevertheless appear in royal inscriptions and on Persepolis reliefs, where their deliveries are depicted as part of the king's wealth. This suggests that Darius's claim that certain peoples brought me tribute included both fixed contributions and voluntary presents, depending on their status. Other peoples enjoyed even greater privileges. The Arabs of southern Palestine, who had aided Cambyses during his Egyptian campaign, were regarded as guests of the Persians and freed from all obligations of tribute or gifts. The Ariaspians of eastern Iran were treated with similar favor, as were certain sanctuaries such as the Temple of Apollo at Magnesia, and even prominent individuals, including the family of Darius's associate Otanes. One issue that still puzzles scholars is Herodotus's statement that Persis itself was exempt from tribute, even though the Persepolis tablets reveal extensive payments from its inhabitants. The solution lies in the terminology. Persis was not subject to tribute in the sense imposed on conquered lands, but its people nevertheless made contributions in other forms. This exemption was one of the privileges Darius granted to his own people during his reign. The tribute, or phoros, seems to have been gathered at the provincial level, and once the portion needed locally had been deducted and the remainder converted into precious metals, it was forwarded to the imperial heartlands. There it was stored in great treasuries to be used for coinage, disbursements, and royal gifts. Beyond the tributes and the offerings from semi-autonomous peoples, the king drew income from several other sources. Among these were the presents he regularly received during his journeys, which he in turn distributed to his friends and benefactors, and the Taj mentioned in Greek accounts, which supported the king and his army as part of the tribute system. All of these contributions served as visible acknowledgments of the king's sovereignty, and the monarch himself must have understood that such revenues could only be maintained if both the land and its people were prosperous. For this reason, his responsibilities included not only defending the empire against enemies, but also safeguarding its natural resources, overseeing irrigation systems, and encouraging the cultivation of new crops. On the provincial scale, satraps and governors were clearly responsible for collecting the tribute connected to the land. They likely relied on traditional precedents dating back to pre-Achaemenid times, consulting existing registers and cadasters to guide them. In this task, they were assisted by hyparchs at the middle level of taxation and by chiliarchs and autonomous urban authorities at the lower level. These local officials were familiar with the fiscal privileges that applied to particular individuals, estates, villages, or towns. Temples, for instance, were among the great landowners in Mesopotamia, Syria, and elsewhere. They were usually subject to taxation, and some of their dependent workers could be conscripted into service, yet the temples also enjoyed royal privileges and received support from the treasury. Another unique category consisted of the military fiefs in Babylonia. These were hereditary but inalienable land grants bestowed on soldiers in return for military service. Over time, however, the soldiers increasingly rented out these estates, and their service obligations were gradually replaced by taxation and compulsory labor. The complex question of how individual and collective taxes mentioned in the Persepolis tablets should be understood belongs to a separate discussion. It is impossible to determine the exact annual revenues of the great king. When Alexander seized the Achaemenid palaces and administrative centers, the quantities of treasure he captured were estimated at around 180,000 talents, equivalent to more than 4,500 tons of silver or nearly 500 tons of gold. Such immense hoards, accumulated over many decades, give a misleading impression of the weight of tribute in any single year, since they were not generally experienced by subjects as unbearably heavy. If the contributions of the Delian League were indeed modeled on the Persian system, as is often suggested, then its effectiveness is clear, especially since it was reorganized and improved by the satrap Artaphernes following the Ionian Revolt. Significantly, no ancient source ever states outright that oppressive levels of tribute had provoked revolts among the empire's peoples. Yet the systematic nature of the fiscal relationship between king and the subjects certainly influenced how later generations judged Darius and Xerxes. To Herodotus, Darius appeared like a merchant, bargaining with his subjects over the price of his authority, while Xerxes, who first had to ensure the stability of his father's reforms and then chose to maintain the system, came to be branded as a tyrant for precisely the same reason. In recent decades, historians have increasingly turned their attention to the sphere of everyday life. Yet it is important to remember that the experiences of individuals in their immediate surroundings were shaped by the larger framework of politics, economy, law, and social order, and cannot be understood apart from this broader context. The daily life of Achaemenid subjects in Iran can only be reconstructed in fragments, both in terms of geography and chronology, and what emerges most clearly from the sources is the world of the aristocratic elite rather than the lives of ordinary men and women. What we know about the latter is owed above all to the clay tablets from Persepolis, which survived due to the destruction that accompanied Alexander's conquest. These documents, though limited in scope, cover the period between 509 and 458 BC and focus primarily on Persis, the imperial heartland, and neighboring Elamites. The transition from clay to parchment halted the continuation of this record, but it is likely that the practice itself endured. The number of tablets is so vast and their detail so striking that while they should be understood as Persian sources tied to the southwestern Iranian heartland, much of their content has wider relevance. They both confirm and expand upon information found in other traditions, and at times they even challenge or expose conventional accounts as formulaic or biased. For this reason, these records have come to occupy a central place in modern research. Still, they are not without difficulties. They are written almost entirely in Elamite, a notoriously challenging language, and the portion that has been published remains incomplete. Interpretations are therefore provisional, though generally well-founded. Among the Persepolis archives are the treasury tablets, which document silver payments to workers between 492 and 458 BC, and the fortification tablets, numbering in the thousands, which date to 509 to 494 BC. The latter are concise administrative notes concerning the collection, transfer, and distribution of food and supplies across the southwestern regions of Iran. These provisions, allocated as daily or monthly rations, were given to individuals, groups of workers, and even animals. Payment was made in kind, and the records demonstrate a meticulous accounting system capable of tracking both income and expenditure. From these tablets, we can reconstruct the maintenance of over 15,000 individuals across more than 100 different settlements. The documents reveal a complex web of activities. Members of the royal family issued orders, correspondence, and sealed confirmations. Officials appear by name, with clearly defined responsibilities. Groups of workers and individual laborers were engaged in specific tasks, their compensation carefully recorded. Taxes in kind were collected, stored, and redistributed to support these workers. Seeds were issued, harvests were noted with precision, and localities were consistently linked to named administrators. Priests received allocations for sacrificial offerings, while travelers were provisioned through a system of tablets recognized at post stations. The distribution of produce was scrupulously documented, with detailed annual settlements and special officials charged with auditing accounts. From these records arise deeper questions. What kinds of people appear in this system, and what status did they hold? What fields of labor, whether in agriculture, craft production, administration, or military service, were represented? And how were these tasks organized and rewarded? How were men and women positioned within these structures? What role did religion, ritual practices, and political circumstances play in shaping daily life in Persis under Darius I? By combining the evidence of the tablets with other sources, it becomes possible to sketch an impression of what was expected of individuals, how they contributed to the functioning of the empire, and what they gained from it in return. When the Persepolis tablets were first studied, scholars quickly noticed that several figures known from classical writers also appeared in these records. Queens, princes, princesses, and other relatives of the royal household, along with satraps and members of the Persian aristocracy, are all present in the documents. They either received or distributed rations that reflected their rank and responsibilities, often in quantities far greater than what was required for personal use. They issued orders to subordinates who traveled on their behalf or traveled themselves and were provided with supplies along the way. Some of them were identified as owners of large estates or groups of workers. Among these individuals are three whose identities are also familiar through Herodotus. One example is Artistone, the daughter of Cyrus, and one of the wives of Darius I. Herodotus describes her as the king's favorite, and their sons, Arsames and Gobryas, later served as commanders during the Persian Wars. Artistone appears in at least 25 Persepolis records, where she is specifically described as a royal family member. She frequently received supplies such as wine, beer, and grain. A tablet from the first month of Darius's 19th year, corresponding to 503 BC, records an order by the king that 200 jugs of wine were to be delivered to her. Another record from the same year details an instruction that 100 sheep from royal property were to be sent to her. Artistone owned at least 3 estates, possibly palaces, one of which was located at Kuganaka, where she hosted her husband in 498 BC. Letters from Persepolis show her regularly sending instructions to her Babylonian steward, while on her many journeys she received provisions for herself and her attendants, sealing the receipts personally. Another well-known figure is Gobryas, who assisted Darius in overthrowing the usurper Gaumata and later accompanied the king on his Scythian expedition. His son Mardonius, who had married Artazostra, the daughter of Darius, became one of the leading Persian commanders in the wars against Greece. Gobryas's prominence is reflected not only in classical tradition, but also in the tablets, which record his appointment as general during the suppression of a revolt in Elam. He was honored on Darius's tomb, where he was depicted as the king's spear-bearer. In the Persepolis records, Gobryas appears among a party of travelers in early 498 BC, probably journeying to meet Mardonius on his return from Ionia. The group included his wife, Radushduka, thought to be Darius's sister, another noblewoman, and Artazostra, the king's daughter and wife of Mardonius, who is listed as receiving rations of flour with a sealed royal document as proof of her entitlement. This evidence shows that the marriage between Mardonius and Artazostra had taken place well before 493 BC, earlier than Herodotus implies. A third example is Artaphernes, the brother of Darius, who is remembered as the satrap of Sardis during the years between 511 and 492 BC. A Persepolis tablet dated to the 9th month of the 27th year of Darius's reign, which corresponds to November 495 BC, confirms his presence in Asia Minor at that time. The document records flour being distributed to a group of men and servants traveling under his authority, carrying his sealed order as they made their way from Sardis to Persepolis. Another important figure in the tablets is Pharnaca, the uncle of Darius, and the head of the empire's economic and administrative system. He received some of the most substantial rations noted in the texts: 2 sheep, 90 measures of wine, and 180 measures of flour every day. These allowances were far more than a single person could consume, and they did not include the rations of his servants, who had separate allocations. It is likely that Pharnaca and other officials stored the surplus or traded it in local markets, a practice that eventually led to the introduction of payments in silver, as later treasury documents reveal. One record notes that Pharnaca personally received 18 measures of flour, while his 300 attendants received 1 measure each. At the lower end of the scale, ordinary adults were given 1 to 1.5 measures of flour a day, while children and younger workers received less. Even so, they could obtain extra allowances under certain conditions. Above this basic level, the amounts increased depending on skill and status, showing a structured system of rank-based distribution within the empire. From the Persepolis tablets, it appears that groups of workers, sometimes entire families, were provided with regular supplies such as grain, flour, and wine or beer, along with occasional distributions of figs, nuts, or small amounts of meat. In addition, they were allowed to cultivate small plots of land, keep animals, and were issued basic clothing. For a long time, these individuals, known in Elamite as kurtap, were thought to be slaves, possibly war captives. Modern scholarship, however, views them more as state laborers who were compelled to perform designated tasks in return for rations and rights. They lived under close supervision, often relocated far from their native regions, which suggests a system of deportation and binding to the land rather than outright slavery. The tablets also reveal Persepolis as a major administrative hub. Between 505 and 497 BC, the official Pharnaca oversaw its management with the assistance of his deputy Chichavahush, clerks, scribes, and other staff. Pharnaca's duties included issuing travel permits for judges, accountants, caravan leaders, and envoys, overseeing the royal storehouses and stables, handling religious affairs, hiring additional labor when needed, and supervising tax and rent payments. His responsibilities required constant travel, but his authority remained tied to the king, while his deputy managed communications on his behalf. Evidence of his work survives in tablets sealed with his mark, including orders for the distribution of goods such as wine to royal artisans. One example records how he ordered over 14,000 liters of wine to be supplied to a group of craftsmen in Persepolis, with the process documented step by step through clerks and scribes, and finalized by delivery at the scheduled time. Beneath this central authority were two high officials known as guardians of the house, each responsible for half of the administrative region covered by the tablets. They supervised agriculture, taxation, and labor recruitment, with district managers under them. These local managers, supported by procurement officers and scribes, were accountable for specific products and also had to provide food and supplies whenever the royal court passed through their district. At the lowest level, workers were grouped under foremen who reported upwards through this hierarchy. Another layer of administration appears in the treasury tablets, which mention a senior official called the treasure keeper. He managed silver disbursements for state workers and controlled at least 19 treasuries across Persis. These institutions not only stored valuables, but also functioned as workshops where hundreds of skilled artisans produced luxury goods for the court. Craftsmen specialized in gold and silver work, textiles, furniture, and other fine objects. Records describe their allowances in detail. Tailors of ceremonial garments, precision workers, furniture restorers, wood carriers, and even children and women listed among the workforce. A single entry notes 77 individuals supported with cereal rations for a month. Beyond the treasury, many more people served the crown in various capacities. They appear in the tablets as farmers, herders, cooks, toolmakers, and other laborers forming the middle and lower tiers of the imperial workforce. Together, these records give a vivid picture of how the Achaemenid state organized and sustained its vast system of labor, resources, and administration from Persepolis. Across the empire, rations were distributed not only as sustenance, but also as a form of wage, carefully adjusted to reflect a person's duties, rank, or level of training. The question naturally arises as to how such a system was financed. Although Herodotus claimed that Persis itself was spared the burden of tribute, the people of the region were far from free of obligations. They paid taxes and dues, and the revenues drawn from these contributions, along with the produce of royal estates, supported the entire redistributive economy. The records do not spell out in detail who shouldered the greater share of this burden, but it is reasonable to assume that freeholding farmers, tenants, and wealthy landowners all contributed in proportion to their means. Some scholars argue that the system resembled a tithe, though the evidence is far from conclusive. The estates owned by the royal family and nobility were equally vital. These lands appear frequently in the tablets, with Queen Artistone, her son Arsames, and the king himself among those mentioned. Estates were often leased to others in return for labor or payment. Some doubled as hunting parks and gardens, as well as productive farmland. Xenophon describes these as vast enclosed domains filled with crops, orchards, and game, which the Greeks called paradisoi. From the Persian word paridaida comes the later Greek and modern term paradise, showing how enduring this image was. At least 15 such royal estates are recorded, each under the supervision of appointed officials. The king himself inspected the lands when he traveled, rewarding governors whose provinces prospered and punishing those whose regions declined through neglect. Persian rulers invested heavily in irrigation to ensure maximum yields. They built underground channels known later as qanats, which drew groundwater across long distances by following the slope of the land. Dams and reservoirs supplemented this system, supplying both crops and towns with water. These improvements often produced surpluses beyond subsistence needs. When combined with a gradual move toward silver-based payments, this suggests that local markets were active, where surplus grain or rations could be exchanged for other necessities. The daily diet reflected this agricultural abundance. Bread made from barley or wheat was the staple food, sometimes seasoned with herbs or salt. Meat was less frequent, but goat, sheep, and poultry were consumed, either roasted or boiled. Wine was popular in Persis, often made from dates or grapes, and unlike Greek custom, it was usually consumed undiluted. Salt and vinegar were used for preservation. In Elam, however, beer was the preferred drink, and allowances were adjusted accordingly. Fruits such as figs, dates, mulberries, apples, and nuts appear in records, while pomegranates and peaches are noted by classical writers. Vegetables and dairy products were likely part of the everyday diet, though they leave little direct trace in the tablets. The Persepolis texts also shed light on travel and communication. A large number concern the provision of travel rations to couriers, messengers, caravan leaders, guards, and work parties on the move for official purposes. Some were tasked with checking roads, others with accompanying embassies, while express messengers carried sealed orders directly from the royal court. Herodotus even recalls how Spartan king Demaratus evaded Persian road watchmen to smuggle a warning about Xerxes' campaign. These couriers formed part of a wider system of communication, which relied on signal fires, relays of fresh horses, and guarded stations. This network was supported by impressive infrastructure. The Persians took over caravan routes established by earlier powers and strengthened them, surfacing stretches with stone or bitumen near major centers. The most famous was the Royal Road, running from Sardis in Asia Minor all the way to Susa, enabling swift troop movement and rapid communication. The tablets confirm the presence of stations and waypoints along this route, where travelers could rest, collect provisions, and present tablets authorizing their rations. Patrols and forts kept the routes safe, so that royal commands and urgent news could cross the empire in remarkable speed. Nothing in the world seemed to move more swiftly than the Persian couriers. Writers describe how men and horses were stationed along the great roads, each pair covering a single day's journey so that no delay was possible. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness could prevent these messengers from completing their stage at the fastest pace. The Persians themselves called this system of post the Angarion. Among the known routes was the road that ran from Persepolis to Ecbatana in Media, a section of which has been discovered cut into the rock near Pasargadae. Another ancient highway linked Mesopotamia with Media, continuing through Bactria to India and still further into Central and Eastern Asia, later forming part of what would become famous as the Silk Road. The Persepolis tablets even record travelers passing between Susa, Persepolis, Media, Egypt, Bactria, Kerman, Aria, Sagartia, Babylonia, the northern coast of the Persian Gulf, Arachosia, and southern Pakistan. Across the deserts, these routes were no more than well-worn caravan tracks, remembered and maintained by experienced leaders. But in Asia Minor and Iran, the roads were kept in remarkably good condition, often laid out along older Assyrian or Hittite lines. Even though they were not paved, it was already noted in Greek comedy that carriages could travel on them with ease. They served equally well for civilian life, transporting men, animals, goods, and information, and for military needs, enabling the rapid deployment of troops, vehicles, baggage, and supplies. The main routes were measured in stades and parasangs, a unit of about 5 or 6 kilometers. Reports suggest that distance columns stood at regular intervals, marking stages and turnings, much like milestones. The very word parasang itself seems to have meant indicator or announcer, and the discovery of a stone marker at Pasargadae from the early Hellenistic period supports the idea that such markers had long existed. Darius also recognized the importance of the sea and worked to turn Elam into a maritime province. He planned to link Susa with the Gulf and strengthened Persian naval presence by settling deported Greeks and Carians who had practical seafaring skills in southern Babylonia and Elam. Persis itself was a land both protected and fertile. One side was closed off by a continuous line of mountains, while the sea formed a natural barrier on another. At the foot of the mountains stretched a wide plain, rich in soil and dotted with villages and towns. Ancient authors, such as Curtius Rufus, wrote of the region's dense population, its healthy climate, and its agricultural abundance, impressions that modern archaeology in the Persepolis plain has confirmed. The Persepolis tablets give a glimpse of this life. They describe Egyptian workers on their way to Tauca being supplied with wine, carrying official documents sealed by the satrap of Elam. Tauca, mentioned also by the geographer Ptolemy, was one of many places where groups of laborers from Thrace, Lycia, or Cappadocia were sent. Yet alongside these workers, there must also have lived free Persian farmers, craftsmen, and landowners, though they are less visible in the administrative records. The idea that Alexander introduced urban life to Iran is contradicted by earlier testimony. Eratosthenes already described the Indians and the Iranians alike as city dwellers among the surrounding peoples. Numerous examples can be cited of towns established under the Achaemenids, including many in Persis itself, though built mainly of sun-dried brick, and now vanished. What survives are the monumental structures, palaces, treasuries, and fortified administrative centers, such as the Great Terrace at Pasargadae. Alongside these, we still find remnants of luxury goods, elegant tableware, ornate furniture, garments, and jewelry, either preserved directly or represented on reliefs. Yet amid this wealth and ambition lay the seeds of decline. Cyrus, the founder, had believed his heirs would inherit the stern traditions of the Persian discipline, a way of life shaped by shepherds and a hard land, producing men able to endure hardship, keep watch at night, and take up arms when needed. But his sons were raised instead in the softer ways of the Medes, under the influence of women and eunuchs who indulged them. They grew up unchecked, their blessed status corrupting them, and so when Cyrus died, they abandoned restraint and plunged into excess. One brother soon killed the other, unwilling to share power. Centuries later, Plato reflected on this cycle in his dialogue Laws. He considered the Persian Empire a lesson in how monarchy, under a wise and capable founder like Cyrus, could easily turn into tyranny once his successors lost discipline. Unlike the balanced systems of Sparta or Crete, which sought harmony and freedom among their citizens, Persia had placed too much strength in the hands of the sovereign. Darius and those who followed repeated the pattern, turning the empire into an oppressive despotism. The decline of Persian rule, as Plato saw it, was rooted in the very way its princes had been educated, spoiled, indulgent, and unfitted for the responsibilities of power. By the early 4th century BC, Greek writers had already developed a dark image of the Persian royal court. where power seemed undermined by the intrigues of women and eunuchs. Ctesias, the physician who served King Artaxerxes II, portrayed the palace as a place of manipulation and moral decay. The instability of Persian sovereignty, in this view, no longer stemmed from the way princes were raised, but from corruption at court. At the same time, other Greek authors argued that Persian decline could be traced back as far as Xerxes, linking it to a loss of discipline, a taste for luxury, and a weakening of character. Xenophon, for example, in the last section of his Cyropedia, compared the vigor and discipline of Cyrus's time with the habits of later Persians. He blamed their downfall on changes in education, the neglect of horsemanship and hunting, the failure to keep promises, and an indulgence in lavish meals, ornate clothing, and idle living. For him, softness and effeminacy, more than anything else, explained the loss of Persian strength. Similarly, the orator Isocrates, in his calls for a united Greek war against Persia, highlighted their lack of fighting spirit and contrasted it with Greek freedom and courage. This idea, however, was not entirely new. As early as the 5th century BC, the great king of Persia had been likened to a despot who stood above the law and flaunted his wealth and absolute power. In Aeschylus's play, The Persians, Xerxes was shown as the tyrant par excellence, a figure of excess and arrogance whose downfall mirrored the dangers of unchecked rule. Greek writers also tied the decline of Persia to broader theories that linked climate, geography, and human character. The Hippocratic treatise, Airs, Waters, Places, suggested that fertile lands softened their inhabitants, while rugged terrain bred strength and resilience. Herodotus gave a vivid example of this in a story about Cyrus, who warned his people that if they abandoned their harsh homeland for richer lands, they would soon lose their power. He argued that fertile countries produced fine fruits, but never strong soldiers. The Persians agreed with him then, but over time they too succumbed to the temptations of luxury, and their eventual defeat by the Greeks, poor but hardened by their rugged country, seemed to confirm this lesson. By the 4th century, what was new was not the association of wealth with weakness, but the increasingly harsh tone of Greek writers. Ctesias's tales of palace corruption, Plato's comments on failed education, and Xenophon's and Isocrates' scorn for Persian arms all contributed to an image of Persia as decadent and effeminate. Isocrates went further, insisting that barbarians were by nature enemies of the Greeks, and that conquest was therefore morally justified. He argued that Persians, because of their supposed inferiority, deserved only to be reduced to the status of dependent peoples under Greek rule. Where Herodotus had once framed the conflict as a matter of overlapping territories between East and West, Isocrates now transformed it into a crusade of civilization against barbarism. Greek descriptions of Persian decadence raise the question of how much of this image was real and how much was shaped by Greek imagination. To understand this, it is useful to look at Persian education and the place of men and women in society. The Persian desire to amass wealth, often criticized as vanity by the Greeks, carried a deeper meaning of preserving resources for power, a sense the Greeks either lacked or deliberately ignored in their arguments. Similarly, claims about the weakening of Persian military spirit need careful reconsideration. According to Herodotus, Persian boys were taught only 3 things between the ages of 5 and 20: how to ride, how to use a bow, and how to tell the truth. This account can be compared with Xenophon's writings, where he describes the rigorous education under Cyrus. Yet Xenophon also laments the decline of this system, claiming that the sons of nobles abandoned hunting and riding, grew physically weaker, and allowed bribery to replace justice. In reality, these stories reflect a code of conduct designed to shape rulers, and Darius himself declared in his epitaph that he valued justice, despised lies, and had mastered horsemanship and archery both on foot and on horseback. Such self-praise does not reveal actual behavior, but presents virtues as tools for royal authority. Xenophon, in mourning their decline after Cyrus's death, was less a historian than a writer, emphasizing the qualities of his ideal ruler, qualities he believed necessary in his own age. Evidence shows that Persians continued to see military skill and hunting as central virtues of kingship. The royal parks, or paradisoi, and countless depictions on coins, seals, and reliefs portraying kings with bows or on the hunt prove that this tradition remained alive well into the 4th century. Local rulers in Asia Minor under Persian rule even copied these ideals. One Lycian ruler, Arbanus, was praised in verse for his skill in archery, hunting on horseback, and noble character. Greek philosophers, too, used Persia as a mirror for their political theories. Plato, for example, linked the downfall of Persia to the poor education of royal sons. His aim was not to describe Persian history, but to argue that a healthy state depends on the moral training of its rulers and citizens. For him, the decline of Persian kingship was a lesson about the dangers of flawed education. Greek stories about the destructive influence of royal women should likewise be seen as literary motifs rather than historical records. Writers such as Ctesias painted Achaemenid queens as schemers, but these accounts were shaped by the widespread suspicion of women in Greek thought, where female influence in politics was often depicted as corrupting. If there was truth in these stories, it lay in the political role of marriage. In a tribal empire where succession was never straightforward, marriages of royal women were vital to maintain loyalty among the nobility. This explains the divided loyalties attributed to women at the courts of Xerxes or Artaxerxes II. They reflected the tensions of dynastic politics rather than personal intrigue. Over time, Persian marriage policy shifted. At first, kings married into the great noble families to secure their allegiance, but later they sought closer ties within their own dynasty. Such endogamous unions, including marriages between half-siblings, puzzled the Greeks and became the subject of scandalous tales. Herodotus, for example, accused Cambyses of marrying his sister, presenting it as one of his crimes. His account dramatized the event as if Cambyses forced the judges to invent a law that permitted kings to marry as they pleased. Yet the reality was more complex. Cambyses's marriage to Atossa, and possibly to another half-sister, likely stemmed from the fact that his earlier marriage produced no heir, leaving succession uncertain. In this context, marrying within the family was a way to strengthen the royal line. Later, even the alleged marriage between Artaxerxes II and his daughter Atossa, which scandalized Greek writers like Plutarch, can be understood differently. If it occurred, it was likely a political move to ensure loyalty within the court after the death of the influential queen Parysatis. Polygamy, a central feature of Persian kingship, allowed rulers to produce heirs, secure alliances, and strengthen ties with both the royal family and the aristocracy. Sons of the king could inherit the throne, hold high positions, or marry strategically to bind noble families to the dynasty. Through this system, the Achaemenid rulers maintained their power, while Greek authors, misunderstanding or disapproving of these customs, turned them into symbols of moral decline. Female members of the Achaemenid royal household are frequently mentioned in the Persepolis fortification tablets, and they emerge as highly active figures. Among them were Artistone, who possessed several estates, Artazostra, the wife of Mardonius, Radushduka, married to Gobrias, and Radushnamuyya. Another was Artabama, who managed her own estate and oversaw hundreds of laborers working in Litu, Hadali, Hunar, and Shiraz. She often traveled from place to place, received vast quantities of supplies, and carefully documented her expenditures with her own seal, which has survived to us. The royal women described in these records appear as decisive and energetic personalities. They organized banquets and joined royal festivities, supervised their estates, issued orders, and traveled widely across the empire. Greek authors later described them accompanying kings on military campaigns. Yet, this active role stood in stark contrast to the Greek ideal of the virtuous woman, who was expected to remain secluded and beyond the gaze of strangers. To Greek observers, Persian women seemed both alluring and threatening, and so they were often imagined as hidden away behind palace walls. In reality, the tablets show that they exercised influence and authority in public and economic life. Over time, however, the Greek view of secluded and scheming Persian women helped fuel the enduring stereotype of decadence within the Persian court, an image that shaped later Western ideas about palace life in the Near East. The notion of Persian decadence, supposedly amplified by the influence of women, became deeply rooted in European thought. German scholarship in particular reinforced this perspective. A Greek history textbook published in 1977, for example, described Persian culture as stagnant and declining, in contrast to the supposed vitality of Greece, which was portrayed as continually renewing the empire with its artists, physicians, and scholars, while receiving little of real value in return. Such judgments grew out of both ancient testimony and 19th-century German views of antiquity. With the Romantic revival of Greek culture, many intellectuals claimed a special kinship between Greeks and Germans, seeing parallels in spirit and character. From this perspective, the Greeks represented freedom and individual creativity, while Persians were depicted as bound by despotism and religious hierarchy. Even when the shared linguistic and cultural heritage of Iranians and Germans was recognized, the admiration remained focused on Greek art, politics, and culture, rather than on Persia. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, German historians largely agreed that Persian power, morality, and productivity had collapsed by the 4th century BC. Explanations varied, but many turned to classical writers such as Plato, Xenophon, and Isocrates for authority. Under National Socialism, however, a new racial explanation was added. The decline of Persia was attributed to the corrupting influence of the Semitic Orient on the Aryan Persians. It was argued that intermarriage, climate, reliance on professional armies, migration to great cities like Susa, Babylon, and Ecbatana, and the spread of money-based economies had eroded the strength of the aristocracy, undermining the ancient principles of blood and land. After the Second World War, scholarship generally returned to the older theme of a contrast between Persian despotism and Greek freedom, with Persia seen as declining politically, culturally, and militarily after the reign of Xerxes. Only in recent decades has this Hellenocentric view been replaced by a more balanced understanding that takes into account both the strengths and the weaknesses of Persian rule, as well as the complex interactions between Greeks and Persians. The fortification tablets also provide a vivid picture of the wider society of Achaemenid Persis. They do not only record the activities of the elite, but also document thousands of workers who received rations. Allowances seem to have depended more on skill and type of work than on gender. Among female staff, a group known as the Arapara stands out, as they received large allocations of grain, wine, and meat. They were long thought to oversee royal workshops, supervising groups of women employed as dressmakers and even male workers. More recent study suggests that they were better understood as female managers in charge of particular groups of laborers associated with members of the royal household. Another group, called the Haranup, also consisted mostly of women and received special rations, though unlike the Papap, they were not tied to the royal family. Both groups, however, demonstrate the important roles women held within the economic system of the empire. In one record, 6.5 merip of beer, collected by Thripata, were handed over to Arzabara and his associates. These rations were distributed among 7 women who had just given birth. 6 of them, each having delivered a son, received 1 merip, while 1 woman who bore a daughter was given half a merip. The entry is dated to the 23rd year and located at Durtaka, under the authority of the workers of Artabama. Another record tells of 13 measures of wheat and barley, likewise procured by Thripata and received by Arzabara and his colleagues, which were distributed to the same group of women. Here again, 6 mothers of sons were granted 2 measures each, while the mother of a daughter received 1. Both records show that mothers of sons were privileged over mothers of daughters. This custom likely extended beyond workers to the free population of Persis as well. Ancient writers confirm such practices. Herodotus noted that, after courage in battle, the greatest sign of manhood was to father many boys, and those with the largest number of sons were honored with an annual royal gift. Darius himself expressed a wish for his loyal subjects to be blessed with many children, long life, and prosperity, linking the strength of the empire directly to its population. The Persian king's power rested on the loyalty of his people, demonstrated through taxation and military service. These obligations also served the king's larger aim of securing peace and stability, both within the empire and along its borders. Accounts from classical authors and depictions in art, such as reliefs from Persepolis and Susa, or later works like the Alexander sarcophagus from Sidon and the mosaic of Alexander at Pompeii, provide us with vivid images of the Achaemenid army. Under Cyrus the Great, this force was essentially a militia, with each man responsible for his own arms and armor, something only the well-off could afford. The Old Persian word for levi, kara, originally referred to the people as a whole, but gradually came to mean specifically the aristocracy. Even as the empire grew, this Persian aristocratic levy formed the backbone of the royal army. Over time, however, it evolved into a standing force, known by the Median term spada, which included Persians, Medes, and Eastern Iranian tribes. In addition to the central units, other subject peoples could be called upon to provide troops in times of need. Border guards, garrisons, and pioneer detachments added further strength. The army was diverse, with charioteers, cavalry on horses and camels, as well as infantry and cavalry units armed with spears or bows. Darius I himself declared in his epitaph that he excelled as a horseman, bowman, and spearman, both on foot and mounted, presenting himself as a model for his troops. A detailed description survives from the Battle of Cunaxa in 401 BC, when Artaxerxes II faced his brother Cyrus the Younger. As the armies approached, First, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, followed by the glint of bronze weapons. The Persian army stretched across the plain, with cavalry on the left under Tissaphernes, troops with wicker shields, Egyptian hoplites bearing tall wooden shields, and further ranks of cavalry and archers. Each contingent was drawn up in tribal formations, while scythed chariots stood apart at intervals. From early on, the Persians also recruited Greek mercenaries. Xenophon observed that they were given food, lodging, and by 401 BC, monthly pay of 1 gold daric. By the later Achaemenid period, such mercenaries were deeply embedded within the army, their leaders often marrying into Persian nobility or becoming royal companions and benefactors. The practice was not a sign of weakness, as some Greek critics claimed, but rather a reflection of both the effectiveness of Greek hoplites and the Persian king's preference for preserving their own peasantry for farming rather than war. These mercenaries were mainly employed in coastal regions of Asia Minor, areas already heavily influenced by Greek culture and rarely penetrated deep into the interior. Greek writers such as Socrates turned the hiring of mercenaries into propaganda, arguing that it revealed Persian decline. His aim, however, was to portray the empire as weak in order to encourage Athens, Sparta, and later Philip of Macedon to unite in war against the so-called barbarians. This idea of a pan-Hellenic crusade against Persia deliberately downplayed the king's real strength and the proven loyalty and valor of his troops. In practice, the Achaemenid army remained a formidable force, capable of reconquering territories like Egypt and suppressing revolts that outsiders wrongly imagined to threaten the empire's stability. Far from showing decline, the use of mercenaries reflected both practical strategy and the vast resources available to the great king. Some ancient accounts downplay Persian military strength, while others inflate it to astonishing levels. Xerxes was said to command more than 2.5 million soldiers. Artaxerxes at Cunaxa supposedly had 900,000, and Darius III was claimed to have led over 1 million men at Gaugamela. Such exaggerated figures served to magnify the brilliance of Greek victories and to emphasize Alexander's achievements, while also casting the boldness of the Greek mercenaries of 401 BC in a new light. The Persian army was organized on a decimal basis, with units of tens, hundreds, and thousands, each led by officers of corresponding rank. A force of 1,000 men was under the command of a Hazarapatip, known to the Greeks as a chiliarch. Higher-ranking officers and generals were drawn from the Persian and Median nobility, often members of the royal family itself. They fought at the head of their troops, and many died in battle. Among the elite forces, the most famous were the 10,000 known as the Immortals. In addition to these, the king was protected by chosen bodyguards. When Xerxes set out from Sardis for his campaign in Greece, he was preceded by spearmen of noble birth, followed by 1,000 hand-picked cavalry, and then 10,000 native infantry selected for their quality. Of these, 1,000 carried spears tipped with golden ornaments, marching at the front and rear of the remaining 9,000, whose spears bore silver fittings. The elite guards directly behind Xerxes also carried weapons decorated with golden apples. This corps was always kept at exactly 10,000 in strength, as every death or illness was immediately replaced, which gave rise to their legendary name. The 1,000 guards with golden apples on their spears formed the king's personal bodyguard, commanded by a Hazarapatip, who held the highest military authority and was one of the king's closest confidants. This officer controlled access to the monarch, but his role was purely military, not administrative. Elite units under such leaders had included Darius during the reign of Cambyses, and Herodotus records that the royal guard perished to the last man at the Battle of Plataea. Many modern scholars believe the name immortals resulted from a Greek misunderstanding of their true Persian designation, which may have meant attendants. Reliefs from Susa and Persepolis likely depict these soldiers, shown in long robes with cords tied around their heads, holding their lances upright and carrying bows and quivers. Persian soldiers generally served between the ages of 20 and 50, fighting both on foot and on horseback. They carried wicker shields, quivers, swords, and knives, and wore high caps and iron-scale armor. Commanders dressed in layered trousers and double tunics with sleeves and cloaks of rich colors in summer or winter. Their turbans resembled those of the Magi, and they wore heavy double-soled shoes. Common soldiers usually wore a shorter tunic with a headcloth, armed with bows and slings. Reliefs and literary sources confirm these details. Infantry carried short swords called akinakis, spears with wooden shafts and metal points, bows often shaped with animal-headed tips, and large or small wicker shields. Helmets were rare, as felt hoods were the norm, but armor covering the chest and shoulders was also in use. The elite sometimes wore long Persian robes, while others adopted the Median style with trousers and cloaks. The cavalry was described as heavily armed. Cyrus the Younger, for instance, rode into battle in armor with a personal guard of 600 horsemen, all equipped with helmets, breastplates, and thigh guards. Their horses were protected by armor over the forehead and chest, and the riders carried sabers as well as spears. Legal texts confirm that Persian cavalrymen were expected to provide their own war horse, armor, helmet, shield, arrows, and weapons. But in return, they were granted land by the king, resembling a feudal arrangement. Other specialized units included camel riders, scythed chariots, and even elephants, which were used in exceptional circumstances such as at Gaugamela. Banners and standards were carried in battle, the royal one bearing an eagle with spread wings above a shield. Persian garrisons were stationed across the empire in both cities and rural regions, maintained by satraps using local resources. Their commanders were men close to the king, tasked with defending the provinces and providing rapid reinforcements when needed. During the reign of Darius and his successors, the empire also maintained a permanent naval fleet, largely based in Cilicia. Persian tactics are relatively well documented. Armies carried baggage trains and relied on supplies stored along the royal roads. Campaigns began in spring, battles were fought in daylight, and rivers were crossed using bridges, rafts, or inflated skins. Engagements typically opened with volleys of arrows and sling stones, intended to weaken the enemy before cavalry and heavy troops struck from the flanks. Against the Greek hoplites, however, these tactics often failed, as the Greek armor, shields, and close combat discipline proved superior. Persian armies also relied heavily on the decisions of their supreme commander, making the targeting of leaders decisive. Thus, the death of Cyrus the Younger at Cunaxa and the flight of Darius III at Issus and Gaugamela determined the outcome of battles that might otherwise have remained undecided. Few topics have caused as much debate among historians as the religious beliefs of the Achaemenid rulers and their subjects. To address this question, it is necessary to set aside the issue of royal religious policy, which has already been widely discussed, and to avoid suggesting that the matter can be resolved once and for all. The central question that often emerges is whether the Achaemenids were followers of Zarathustra, known to the Greeks as Zoroaster, and whether they practiced his teachings in their original form or in later adaptations. Much less attention, however, has been given to how these kings viewed the role of worship itself and the political value they attached to religion. To explore the problem, it is useful to ask some fundamental questions. Who was Zarathustra? When and where did he live? What purpose did his hymns serve, and to whom were they addressed? What form of Zoroastrianism, if any, existed during the Achaemenid era? None of these questions have clear answers. The date and the homeland of Zarathustra remain as uncertain as the true meaning of his message or its relationship to the texts that emerged centuries later. The primary source for Zarathustra's ideas and the beliefs of his followers is the Avesta, regarded as the holy scripture of Zoroastrianism. Alongside these texts, composed in the Avestan language, there exist Middle Persian translations and commentaries known as Zond. Scholars study these works both for their linguistic value, as examples of Old Iranian closely related to Old Persian, and for the insight they provide into the spiritual world of Zarathustra. The Avesta, as we have it, was not the work of a single moment, but a compilation that developed across centuries, preserved and systematized through the cooperation of priests and rulers, especially under the Sasanians. Despite later efforts by Zoroastrian communities in Iran and India, only fragments of the original corpus survive, and the earliest manuscript we possess dates to the late 13th century. According to Middle Persian traditions, the Avesta once consisted of 21 books created by Ahura Mazda and given to King Vishtaspa through Zarathustra. Over time, these writings were dispersed, partially destroyed, or recompiled by later monarchs, including Parthian and Sasanian kings. Modern scholarship has shown that the oldest sections, such as the Gathas and certain prayers, predate the rest by several centuries and were originally transmitted orally with great care by priestly schools. This makes the theory that the Avesta was written down in the Achaemenid period unlikely, even if the tradition may have suffered interruptions before eventually being written and canonized in Sasanian times. A new alphabet was devised for this purpose, combining features of Middle Persian and influences from Greek writing. After the Islamic conquest, the tradition weakened, the priesthood was scattered, and the transmission of the texts deteriorated. All surviving manuscripts trace back to a 9th or 10th century prototype. The Avesta became known in Europe only in the 18th century, when it was brought to light by the French scholar Anquetil Duperron. Today, Zoroastrians still use it as a holy text, though it is not a single unified work, but a series of distinct writings shaped for liturgical practice. Among its sections are the Yasna, which includes the ancient Gathas, and the Yasna Haptangheti, the Visprad, with supplementary prayers for seasonal festivals, the Corda Avesta, a shorter version used by laypeople, the Sirosa, naming the divinities of the 30 days of the month, the Yashts, hymns to major deities that preserve much early tradition, the Videvdad, a collection of laws and rituals dealing with purity, expiation, and even a story of Zarathustra's temptation, and various smaller fragments. The original homeland and date of these writings are still disputed. The dialect of Persis is generally ruled out, leading some to place their origins in the northeast, in regions such as Bactria, Margiana, or Sistan, while others favor the northwest. Many scholars now agree that the Gathas may date to around 1000 BC, which would also suggest the lifetime of Zarathustra, while the younger parts of the Avesta are thought to have been composed several centuries later, possibly during the Achaemenid period. Yet, beyond these general views, there is little consensus. The meaning of the Gathas, the circumstances in which they were composed, and the true role of Zarathustra remain open to interpretation. Some argue that the tradition split into two currents, one in the West, dominated by Magian priests in Media, and another in the East, centered in Arachosia, from where it may have spread to Persis under Darius I. Others claim that the Medes and Persians brought a form of the faith westward at the beginning of the first millennium BC, already distinct from Zarathustra's original message, and that it was reshaped under Magian influence and adapted to the needs of the empire. Another theory suggests that Eastern Iranian traditions entered the West in the last decades of Median rule through both missionaries and dynastic ties, so that the Achaemenids were Zoroastrians from the very outset. The problem of how closely the Achaemenid kings followed Zarathustra's teachings remains unresolved. Some scholars believe that every ruler adhered to his doctrine, others that only Darius and his successors did so, while still others argue that the usurper Gaumata was the true champion of the creed. What is clear is that royal promotion of Zoroastrianism often served political ends as much as religious conviction, reflecting the complex interplay between faith and power in the ancient Persian Empire. To determine whether the religion of the Achaemenids was linked to Zoroastrianism, it is necessary to outline some key elements of Zoroastrian belief and how they changed over time. The Gathas, the hymns attributed to Zarathustra, describe a system centered on a single god, Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord. Alongside him stood other Ahuras, personifications of concepts who served as his assistants, sometimes portrayed as his sons or daughters. Among them, Asha, representing truth, had a particularly important role. In the later Avesta, however, Ahura Mazda appears as the supreme figure accompanied by 6 entities known as the Amesha Spentus, often explained as allegories or archangels. Unlike in the earlier hymns, this group had become well-defined and was even integrated into the calendar, each one linked to a day of the first week of every month. The language of the Gathas shows close similarities with the Rig Veda of India, a detail often used to date them to the end of the 2nd millennium BC. The comparison is not only linguistic, but also religious. In the Rig Veda, the Asuras gradually decline in status and are cast as demons in opposition to the beneficent Devas. In the Iranian tradition, the reverse occurred. The Ahuras retained their divine position, while the Devas were reduced to demons and expelled from the pantheon. Zarathustra also seems to have opposed certain older practices, such as the sacrifice of animals or the ritual use of the intoxicating drink hyoma in its strongest form. In the younger Avesta, composed a few centuries later, Zarathustra's message had been reshaped. Although the Devas remained cursed, parts of the older Indo-Iranian pantheon reappeared as positive figures. Mithra, the god of contracts, and Vayu retained their ancient names, while others like Varithragna and Anahita were identified by attributes that had originally described them. It is uncertain when or why this change took place. The Avesta at this stage presents a clearly polytheistic picture dominated by Ahura Mazda, but the earliest form of Mazdaism is harder to classify. As one modern scholar has described it, Ahura Mazda stood among beings who were not yet fully gods and others who had ceased to be gods, producing a religion that could be seen either as unstable monotheism or unstable polytheism. Ethics and eschatology also form a central part of this tradition. The Vidivdad, a later Avestan work with possible Achaemenid roots, presents the faith in explicitly dualistic terms. Ahura Mazda embodies good and light, while Angra Mainyu represents evil and darkness. Both are said to have created the world, and each rules his own sphere within it. From the very beginning, they struggle for supremacy, and humanity is called to choose sides in a cosmic conflict that will ultimately end with the victory of good. Classical writers also noticed this dualism. Plutarch explained that most wise men believed in two opposed powers, one creating good and the other evil. He identified them with Oramazos, comparable to light, and Aramanius, linked to darkness and ignorance, placing Mithras between the two. According to his account, Oramazes created beneficent gods, while Aramanius produced opposing figures to challenge them. The struggle filled the world with both good and evil. But one day, Aramanius would be destroyed, and humankind would live in harmony under a single order and a single tongue. The Gathas already emphasize the importance of moral choice, and scholars debate whether the doctrine of a good and evil spirit below Ahura Mazda preceded the later formulation of Mazda and Angra Mainyu as direct rivals. This brings us back to the question of whether the Achaemenid kings followed something recognizably Zoroastrian. If any link existed, it must have been with the later Avesta rather than the earliest hymns. Several points remain uncertain. Darius frequently names Ahura Mazda as the greatest of gods, but also refers to him together with the other gods. This language suggests that his faith was not monotheistic. Was his devotion to Ahura Mazda simply an extension of older Iranian traditions, or was it connected to Zoroastrian teaching? When he spoke of the Bhaga and the Avesta referred to divine beings as Yazatas, do these words mean the same or reflect a distinction? Should the Persian value of speaking the truth, noted by Herodotus, be connected with the Avesta's contrast between truth and falsehood? And when Xerxes described his battle against the Daiva, was this the same rejection of devas found in Zoroastrianism? Even burial customs raise questions. The royal tombs of Cyrus and his successors appear to go against the later Zoroastrian injunction to expose corpses, but they may represent an earlier stage of the religion, or perhaps kings were exceptions to the rule. It is clear that the Achaemenid king's faith cannot easily be defined. What can be said is that Darius, by choosing Ahura Mazda, appealed both to a familiar deity and to a powerful source of legitimacy. Whether this devotion was sincerely felt or mainly political cannot be known. For the subjects of the empire, truth and falsehood carried profound moral meaning. For the king, however, falsehood simply meant rebellion against his divinely sanctioned rule, while truth was whatever upheld the authority granted to him by Ahura Mazda. When we turn to religious life in Persis, the Persepolis tablets provide valuable insight. They show that the Achaemenid kings, as seen with Cyrus and Xerxes, permitted their subjects to worship a wide variety of gods and even gave support to these practices. Within certain regions, Iranian deities such as Visai Bhaga, Durva, possibly identified with Zurvan, Varira, Naryasanga, Ardanafravartish, Spantaragardia, Mijdushish, and Bartakamya were honored. Natural features like mountains and rivers also received offerings. In Elamites, however, the cults were focused almost entirely on Elamite gods, like Humban and Naparisha, along with the Babylonian storm god Adad. Evidence for the worship of Ahura Mazda in these records is relatively limited, appearing only 10 times. Yet the sacrifice known as Lan seems to have been his official offering. This ritual was distinctive because it was funded directly from the royal rations, and unlike other sacrifices, it was widespread and consistently provided for. A special group of priests, known as the Atarvakspa, was appointed exclusively to perform this sacrifice. The Magi, too, were partly authorized to conduct it, though they are also recorded as serving in the cults of other Iranian deities. Another priestly class, referred to with the Elamite title Patin, mainly served in the worship of foreign gods, but could also officiate for Iranian divinities when required. The Magi are especially noteworthy, as accounts portray them not only as religious figures, but also as educators, administrators, and interpreters of tradition. They played important roles in royal ceremonies, including investitures and burials, and were also consulted in matters such as dream interpretation. Their precise religious stance, however, is difficult to define. It remains uncertain whether they were responsible for introducing Zoroastrianism into Persis, whether only a portion of them adopted it, or whether it was Darius who officially placed them in charge of Zoroastrian ritual. These questions remain open to debate. The reign of the Achaemenid dynasty ended when Alexander of Macedon seized the royal capitals and, following the death of King Darius, crushed the remaining resistance in eastern Iran with uncompromising force. To the Greeks, he portrayed his invasion as a campaign of vengeance for Xerxes' expedition against Greece, but his real ambition was far greater: the conquest of the Persian Empire and the establishment of his own authority over the vast lands stretching between Greece and India. Many of his contemporaries struggled to understand why he sought legitimacy among the Iranians themselves, presenting himself as the avenger of the murdered Darius, adopting Persian dress and court rituals, organizing native military units, marrying into the royal family, and elevating Persian nobles to positions of trust in both his household and provincial governments. It has become clear that this policy of aligning himself with Achaemenid traditions did not begin after Darius's death, as once believed, but rather from the moment Alexander entered the empire. The preserved Greek accounts reveal that he fully understood the conditions that had defined Achaemenid kingship, and deliberately fulfilled them for himself. In Asia Minor, he appeared as a guarantor of order and stability, and after the Battle of Issus, he even described himself as a rightful claimant to the Achaemenid throne. He challenged Darius to prove his sovereignty in battle, took charge of the royal household and its soldiers, accused his rival of having seized power unlawfully, and attributed his own victories to the will of the gods who protected both the empire and the Achaemenid dynasty. Persian kingship had long attracted ambitious rulers like Alexander and even his father Philip. It combined the sanctity of a dynasty chosen by the gods with universal claims to authority, a unique bond between ruler and subjects, and supremacy over the nobility. Alexander's time in Persis demonstrated his determination not to break with this heritage, but to continue it. By honoring Persian traditions and acknowledging the greatness of the empire, he sought to win the loyalty of both the aristocracy and the wider population. His deliberate presence in Persis, at the very heart of the empire that Darius had abandoned, symbolized this policy. He paid homage to Cyrus the Great, whose model he openly followed, yet at the same time he ordered parts of Persepolis to be burned, erasing the memory of Xerxes, while also ensuring that no rival could claim the immense treasures stored there. To the Greeks, the fire represented the triumphant conclusion of their revenge campaign, but to the Persians it signaled that survival depended on compromise with the conqueror, an outcome that suited Alexander's aims perfectly. The murder of Darius by Bessus further strengthened Alexander's position in Iran. By showing respect to his fallen opponent and presenting himself as his rightful successor, he claimed to avenge Darius and thus inherit his throne. When Bessus proclaimed himself king under the name Artaxerxes, Alexander upheld Persian court protocol by condemning him as an usurper and executing him according to local custom. Yet this adoption of Persian traditions disturbed many of his Macedonian companions, and unrest in eastern Iran, an old Achaemenid stronghold, persisted. Even in Persis, he eventually faced resistance after the hardships of the campaigns at the Hyphasis and in Gedrosia. His victories there were achieved only through merciless violence, which later earned him a dark reputation in Iranian Zoroastrian memory. Over time, however, tensions eased. His marriage to the Bactrian princess Roxane, the grand ceremonies at Susa, the celebrations at Opis, and his later condemnation of the burning of Persepolis all helped restore stability. Above all, the policies of his satrap Pusestas in Persis were decisive. By wearing Median attire, learning the Persian language, adopting local customs, and working closely with the regional nobility, Pusestas won the trust of the people and ensured a measure of cooperation that greatly strengthened Alexander's rule in the Iranian heartland. Although Persis remained relatively calm after Alexander's death, largely due to the policies of Pusestas, unrest broke out elsewhere in the empire even before or soon after the king's passing. In Bactria, the local population supported Greek settlers in their rebellion, apparently motivated by a desire to end Macedonian rule. In India, Chandragupta Maurya expelled the Macedonian vassal in the Punjab, while in Media Atropatene, the former satrap Atropates established his own kingdom and dynasty around 323 BC. A few years later, in 316/317 BC, the governors of the eastern provinces, known as the Upper Satrapies, which included Persis, Carmania, Aria, Arachosia, Bactria, Sogdia, and Paropamisade, threw their support behind Eumenes in his struggle against Antigonus. Their backing, however, was driven less by loyalty to Eumenes or the royal heirs than by their desire to safeguard their own power and positions during the turbulent years that followed Alexander's death. On the eve of Eumenes's decisive clash with Antigonus, Pusestas hosted an elaborate sacrificial feast at Persepolis. Ancient accounts describe how he gathered vast numbers of animals and supplies from across Persia, organizing the event according to Persian customs. The feast was arranged in 4 concentric circles of participants. The outermost ring held the famous Macedonian silver shields and Alexander's veteran companions. The second circle included cavalry, generals, and officers. The third ring was reserved for leading commanders and honored Persians. And at the very center stood altars dedicated to the gods, as well as to Alexander and Philip. Such a spectacle, deeply rooted in Persian tradition, highlighted Pusestas's close alliance with the local aristocracy and the active involvement of native elites. The gods honored may have included Persian deities, though by this time Greek and Iranian divinities were often identified with one another. Archaeological finds in Persepolis, including inscribed dedicatory altar plates to Zeus, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, and Helios, may reflect such shared rituals. Despite this, Pusestas's shifting loyalties during the conflict, switching sides to Antigonus, did not spare him from dismissal, even though Persian nobles protested on his behalf. After these struggles, Seleucus gained control of nearly all of Iran between 312 and 301 BC, ruling from his base in Babylon. His attempt to expand into India ended in defeat against Chandragupta, forcing him to cede territories including Gandhara, the Upper Indus, Paropamisade, and eastern Arachosia in exchange for an alliance and a supply of war elephants. Meanwhile, Media Atropatene remained independent, as did Choresmia, which had secured its autonomy during the late Achaemenid era and retained it under both Alexander and the Seleucids. Of particular importance to Seleucid rule were Bactria and Sogdia, regions long threatened by nomadic incursions. To defend them, the Seleucids established fortified settlements and military colonies. Early Seleucid foundations in Iran included Raga near modern Tehran, Hecatopolis at Shar-i-Kumis, Antiochia in Persis, Antiochia in Margiana near Merv, another Antiochia in Scythia, Sotira in Arria, and most notably Ai-Khanum on the Oxus, the best-studied archaeological site from this period. For many years, scholars interpreted Seleucid policy in the East as a sharp break from Persian traditions, an outright Macedonization of the region. Recent research, however, has overturned this view. The Seleucids largely continued Alexander's strategies, forming dynastic marriages with local elites, employing Iranians in military, administrative, and court roles, and adopting Persian and Mesopotamian models for royal residences, infrastructure, and kingship ideology. They also retained elements of Persian court art and ceremony. The once popular idea that cultural diversity and the balance between center and periphery weakened the empire from the start has been re-examined. It is now understood that the Seleucids maintained effective control over much of Iran until the mid-2nd century BC, when simultaneous pressures from Parthia in the east and Rome in the west eroded their authority. Only then did Iranian aristocracies begin to pursue their own independent ambitions. The relationship between Greeks and native populations was also more complex than earlier historians believed. Communities of diverse ethnic and cultural origins had already coexisted since the Achaemenid period, and Seleucid rule built on these interactions rather than replacing them. This calls into question older notions of Hellenism and Hellenization, which require redefinition in light of the evidence. Archaeology shows that Seleucid rule in Media included the establishment of Greek-style cities and dynastic cults, such as the inscription from Laodicea/Nihavand, dated to 193 BC, that records honors to Antiochus III and his queen, Laodice. Seleucid garrisons were stationed in strategic locations, including the caves of Karaftu in Kurdistan, while Ecbatana continued to serve as both a palace and a mint. In Persis itself, native opposition to Seleucid authority seems to have been minimal and short-lived. By the late 3rd or early 2nd century BC, local dynasts known as Frateraka governed the region on behalf of the Seleucids. Their coinage and ceremonial practices emphasized continuity with Achaemenid traditions, but they did not claim the status of great kings. Only after Seleucid power fractured under external pressure did these rulers distance themselves, though they later realigned with the Seleucids when confronted by the rising strength of Parthia. Like their predecessors, the Parthians were willing to allow local Persian rulers a degree of autonomy, since these dynasts had no aspirations to rule beyond their immediate region. Later, Sasanian tradition grouped these rulers with the lesser kings, and by that time any living memory of the Achaemenids had already faded. Although the Frateraka portrayed themselves as devout Zoroastrians, they were not leaders of a religious nationalist movement nor priestly monarchs. Their role was primarily political, administrative, and military, while the Magi likely continued the same functions they had held under the Achaemenids. Zoroastrian clergy retained negative memories of the Greeks, especially Alexander. But during the Seleucid period, these sentiments had no real political weight. The long stretch of stable Seleucid rule in Persis demonstrates that the region was not a bastion of resistance to Greek influence. Instead, it shows that foreign rulers adapted themselves to Persian traditions. How far Persis was truly Hellenized remains uncertain. Archaeological evidence suggests only a limited Greek presence, but the example of Antiochia in Persis warns against dismissing the possibility of deeper cultural exchanges in the absence of written records. Under Seucid rule, Median and Persian troops remained an essential part of the military forces, as demonstrated by the revolt of Mullan. Media's position as a key crossroads between Mesopotamia and northeastern Iran, and Persis's role as a vital link between southeastern Iran, Susiana, and the Persian Gulf, make it clear that these regions were not neglected by the Seleucids. In Susiana, and especially in Susa, the Seleucid presence is strongly attested by both inscriptions and archaeology. In Seleucia on the Euleus, Susa, which housed a royal residence, a garrison, fiscal administrators, and even a gymnasium, inscriptions reveal the existence of a ruler cult. The Greek language, script, and institutions continued to thrive in Susa well into the Parthian era. In contrast, although Aria and Drangiana, modern Sistan, were firmly under Seleucid control, archaeological traces of Greek life there remain limited. Hyrcania, too, stayed in Seleucid hands until the time of Antiochus III, when it was seized by the Parthians. Margiana, in present-day Turkmenistan, seems to have slipped away earlier. Excavations at Gyar Kale have identified it with Antiochia in Margiana, founded by Antiochus I on the foundations of an older Achaemenid citadel, and laid out in a planned circular form with two main streets crossing at right angles. Parthia, which would later give its name to the successors of the Seleucids in Iran, first established its centers of power in the northern part of the province near modern Ashgabat. Only in the 2nd century BC did the Seleucids gradually lose the regions south of the Kopet Dagh, Binalud, and Elburz mountains. In the east, Seleucus I had ceded the Indus Valley, Gedrosia, Gandhara, the Swat Valley, and eastern Arachosia to Chandragupta through treaty, but western Arachosia, with its old Achaemenid capital at Kandahar, remained under Seleucid rule for some time before being absorbed into the Mauryan Empire under Bindusara or Ashoka. The inscriptions of Ashoka, the famous Mauryan emperor and contemporary of Antiochus II, confirm the presence of Greeks and Iranians in his dominion. These inscriptions, written in Greek, Aramaic, and Indian languages, not only demonstrate the reach of his rule, but also show his attempt to influence foreign populations with Buddhist ideals of social duty and piety. At the same time, Achaemenid traditions left a deep imprint on the political and cultural structures of the Mauryan state. Towards the close of the 2nd century BC, Arachosia and Drangiana were overrun by Sakha tribes, who gave their name to the latter, transforming it into what later became known as Sistan. The complex history of these southeastern regions, marked by Parthian, Sakha, Greek, Indian, and Kushan interactions, remains one of the most debated subjects among scholars. Bactria, celebrated since the time of Alexander for its fertility, has come into sharper focus through archaeological, numismatic, and inscriptional discoveries. Together with Sogdia, it had formed a single satrapy under both the Achaemenids and the Seleucids. The Seer Daria, Jaxartes, marked the edge of the steppe world of Central Asia and Siberia, with Alexandria Aeshate, later Antiochia, at Cogent, serving as a frontier stronghold. Beyond it stretched a broad zone of interaction between nomads of the steppes and settled communities in the oases. Among the most remarkable Hellenistic sites is Ai-Khanum on the Oxus, a settlement that provides exceptional insight into Greek life in eastern Iran. Established in the late 4th century, it flourished under the Greco-Bactrian kings before succumbing to nomadic invasions in the 2nd century before Christ. Its remains include a theater, temples, a gymnasium, a palace, fortified walls, administrative complexes, and grand private houses. The city reflects a blend of Greek, Bactrian, Achaemenid, and Mesopotamian influences. The Greek presence is confirmed not only through personal names and dedications to Greek gods, but also through inscriptions, including one found in 1966 on the base of a statue in the Harun, believed to be the burial site of Cnaeus, the city's founder. On one side of the discovery was an epigram, noting that a man named Clearchus had set up a copy of the Delphic maxims of the 7 sages, while on the other were the final 5 sayings from a set of 12. The first 7 must once have been inscribed on a stele that has since disappeared. The epigram itself declares, "These wise words of the renowned men of old were first displayed at Holy Pytho in Delphi. Clearchus, having carefully copied them, placed them here in the sanctuary of Cnaeus. The 5 surviving maxims advise, as a child, be obedient. As a youth, be disciplined. As a grown man, act justly. In old age, give wise counsel. In death, cause no sorrow." This Clearchus is recognized as a peripatetic philosopher from Soli in Cyprus, who appears to have traveled east around 300 BC. During this journey, he visited Greek communities living in the eastern Iranian regions, including Ai-Khanum. The fact that he recorded and shared the Delphic sayings there suggests that he found a receptive audience for Greek philosophy. Additional traces of Greek learning were uncovered in impressions of papyrus and parchment, which, though now lost, are thought to have contained parts of a dialogue on Plato's theory of knowledge and fragments of iambic verse. Other pieces of evidence for Greek education in the region include a fragmentary funerary epigram from Giga Tepe in the Balkh Oasis, an inscription to the river god Oxus left by a Bactrian on a bronze Silenus statuette at Takhti Sangan, and a metrical dedication found at Kandahar. Likewise, the Greek inscriptions of Ashoka demonstrate both the presence of Greek settlers in Arachosia and the familiarity of the ruler, or those rendering his edicts, with Platonic and Aristotelian ideas. Sogdia also reveals clear signs of Greek influence, as shown by archaeological work at Maracanda, modern Samarkand, where the remains of a Greek colony have been uncovered. After Antiochus III's eastern campaign, Bactria permanently broke away from Seleucid control, forming what became known as the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom. This realm, stretching south to the Hindu Kush and east to the Badakhshan Mountains, later absorbed Sogdia as well. Its southern expansion eventually produced independent Indo-Greek states, which endured for several decades after the fall of Bactria around 130 BC. Hellenistic traditions lived on in Gandhara, where Buddhist art absorbed Greek elements. By the late 2nd century BC, the Yuezhi settled north of the Hindu Kush, and from them emerged the Kushan dynasty, which went on to dominate a vast empire spanning Central Asia and India. Under Kushan rule, northeastern Iran once more prospered. Agriculture intensified, cities expanded, trade in silk flourished, and Buddhist monks established themselves in the region. Greek influence did not vanish, however. The Bactrian language came to be written with a modified Greek script, and the coinage of the early Kushans still displayed Greek legends and depictions of Greek deities.